The Great Pyramid of Khufu stands on the Giza Plateau as one of humanity's most monumental achievements, a structure comprising approximately 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons, arranged with such precision that a human hair cannot fit between many of the stones even today, more than 4,500 years after its construction was completed around 2584 before the Common Era. The pyramid rises 481 feet into the desert sky, and its construction required an estimated 23 years of continuous labor, involving at minimum 10,000 workers rotating through the project in seasonal shifts, all coordinated without written blueprints as we understand them, without modern machinery, without the wheel being used in any meaningful capacity for transport, and without any contemporary written records explaining the methods employed. The psychological mechanism that captivated ancient minds and continues to fascinate modern observers involves the human tendency to attribute the impossible to either divine intervention or superhuman capability, a cognitive pattern that emerges when we encounter accomplishments that exceed our immediate comprehension or that seem to violate the natural order of feasibility. When we observe the perfect astronomical alignment of the pyramid's sides to cardinal directions, accurate to within a fraction of a degree, or when we recognize that the structure's dimensions encode mathematical relationships that appear to reference values we associate with planetary measurements and circular geometry, our minds naturally leap toward supernatural explanations rather than toward the patient, incremental, and entirely human processes of observation, trial. An era that characterized ancient Egyptian engineering. We have normalized the mystification of the pyramid in our contemporary discourse, perpetuating narratives about lost knowledge, advanced civilizations, and secret technologies despite decades of archaeological evidence, experimental reconstruction, tool marks on stone blocks, workers' villages, administrative records, and the documented evolution of pyramid construction methods across multiple dynasties that collectively demonstrate the pyramid was built through ingenuity, organization, and determination rather than through mechanisms we have somehow forgotten. The construction likely involved ramps, leverage systems, and countless human hands coordinated through hierarchical administration, yet the sheer magnitude of coordination and the absence of detailed blueprints continue to generate alternative theories even when conventional explanations remain entirely plausible and supported by evidence. Deep within the archives of Byzantine history lies one of the ancient world's most carefully guarded military secrets, a weapon so devastating and so shrouded in mystery that even today, centuries after its last use, scholars and historians find themselves unable to fully reconstruct its exact composition. This was Greek fire, an incendiary substance that the Byzantine Empire wielded with terrifying effectiveness throughout the medieval period, transforming naval warfare and allowing a relatively modest empire to maintain dominance over far larger and more numerous enemies who sought to conquer its territories. The formula itself, reportedly invented or perfected during the reign of Emperor Constantine VII in the 7th century, was protected with such extreme secrecy that knowledge of its creation was restricted to perhaps only a handful of trusted craftsmen, military engineers, and the emperor himself. With strict protocols in place to ensure that no unauthorized person could ever learn the method of its manufacture or discover the specific ingredients that made it so extraordinarily effective. What we know of Greek fire comes primarily through historical accounts written by Byzantine chroniclers and the observations of enemies who witnessed its terrifying effects firsthand during naval sieges and military engagements, creating a fascinating puzzle of historical investigation. According to these accounts, Greek fire could ignite upon contact with water rather than being extinguished by it. It burned with such intensity and heat that it could not be easily extinguished by conventional means, and it adhered to surfaces and to the bodies of those it touched, spreading and intensifying rather than dissipating. The psychological mechanism behind the obsessive secrecy surrounding Greek fire relates fundamentally to how civilizations have always understood technological superiority as a direct pathway to survival and dominance in a world where military might determines the fate of nations and empires. The Byzantines recognized that this weapon provided them with an asymmetrical advantage over adversaries who might otherwise overwhelm them through sheer numbers or superior conventional military strength. And they understood intuitively that sharing or losing this knowledge would be tantamount to surrendering their own security and the security of their people. The Roman Empire, at the height of its architectural ambition, developed a concrete formula so sophisticated and enduring that structures built with this material still stand today, nearly 2,000 years after their construction, while modern concrete begins to deteriorate within a mere century. The recipe, known as opus cementitium, combined volcanic ash from specific regions around Naples with lime, seawater, and carefully selected aggregates like pumice and tufa stone, creating a material that actually grows stronger over time as it undergoes a chemical process called pozzolanic reaction, wherein the volcanic minerals bond with the lime in a slow, inexorable process that can take decades or even centuries to fully complete. The Romans guarded this knowledge fiercely, understanding intuitively that controlling the formula for concrete meant controlling the ability to build empires, to construct aqueducts that could carry fresh water across hundreds of miles, to create amphitheaters and ports and bridges that would outlast kingdoms and dynasties. Yet what makes this secret particularly fascinating is not merely that the Romans possessed superior chemistry, but that they understood something fundamental about durability that our modern world, despite all our scientific advancement and computational power, largely abandoned in favor of cheaper, faster production methods that sacrifice longevity for immediate profit. The mechanism underlying this choice involves a complex interplay of economic incentives, the professionalization of building trades that separated knowledge from practice, and the shift toward standardized materials that could be mass-produced rather than carefully calibrated to local conditions. We have somehow normalized the idea that buildings should require constant maintenance and eventual replacement, that concrete should crack and spall within decades, that infrastructure exists in a state of perpetual decay requiring endless repair budgets, when the Romans demonstrated conclusively that with patience and proper materials, structures could endure indefinitely. The persistence of inferior concrete practices, despite this historical evidence, suggests that we have lost not merely a recipe, but an entire philosophical approach to construction that valued permanence and craftsmanship over convenience and quarterly earnings. This philosophical shift represents a profound loss, not in our capacity to build, but in our willingness to imagine structures that might outlive us by millennia, to invest in futures we ourselves will never inhabit, a choice that reveals something troubling about how modern civilization measures value and success. Deep beneath the waters of the Aegean Sea, near the Greek island of Antikythera, a Roman merchant vessel sank over 2,000 years ago, carrying with it one of the most perplexing artifacts ever discovered by human hands. In 1895, divers searching for sponges stumbled upon the wreck, and among the corroded bronze statues and marble treasures lay a device so technologically sophisticated that scholars initially believed it to be a misplaced artifact from a much later era, perhaps even from the Renaissance period or beyond. This object, known as the Antikythera mechanism, consists of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, each precisely calibrated and arranged in a wooden case no larger than a modern shoebox. Yet its purpose remained a mystery that would baffle archaeologists and historians for more than a century. As scientists carefully cleaned and examined the fragments, they discovered astronomical markings etched into its surface, references to the zodiac, and inscriptions written in ancient Greek that suggested calculations of celestial bodies and their movements across the heavens. Through advanced imaging techniques and meticulous reconstruction, researchers eventually concluded that this remarkable device functioned as an analog computer designed to predict astronomical phenomena, to calculate the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, and to determine the dates of lunar and solar eclipses years in advance with remarkable accuracy. The mechanism embodied a mathematical sophistication and mechanical ingenuity that seemed impossibly advanced for its time. Yet the ancient Greeks and their technological predecessors possessed knowledge that had been lost, fragmented, and scattered across centuries of cultural upheaval and historical discontinuity. What makes the Antikythera mechanism's purpose so profound is not merely what it did, but rather what its very existence reveals about the capabilities and intellectual achievements of antiquity, suggesting that ancient civilizations possessed computational abilities and astronomical knowledge that rivaled what would not be replicated again until the development of mechanical clocks and astronomical instruments in medieval and early modern Europe, thousands of years later. This realization fundamentally challenges our conventional understanding of technological progress and forces us to reconsider what knowledge may have been lost during the darker periods of history, reminding us that the path of human advancement is neither linear nor inevitable, but rather cyclical and fragile, dependent upon the preservation and transmission of wisdom across generations. In the ancient workshops of Damascus and the surrounding Levantan regions, master blacksmiths possessed a technique for creating steel that seemed almost supernatural in its properties, producing blades with distinctive wavy patterns that caught light like liquid metal frozen in solid form, blades that could reportedly hold an edge sharp enough to split a hair while remaining flexible enough to bend without breaking. And these remarkable weapons became so legendary that European crusaders returning from the Holy Land spoke of them in hushed, reverent tones, as if they had encountered objects of genuine magic rather than mere craftsmanship. The psychological power of these Damascus steel weapons lay not merely in their functional superiority, but in the absolute mystery that surrounded their creation, for no amount of observation or inquiry could reveal the exact process, and this inscrutability transformed the blades from tools into talismans, objects that seemed to possess knowledge beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. The actual mechanism behind Damascus steel involved the careful selection and blending of different iron ore sources, each containing distinct impurities and carbon content, which were then repeatedly heated, folded, and hammered in a process that required not just physical skill, but an almost intuitive understanding of how metal behaves under extreme conditions, creating a microstructure of different steel types layered throughout the blade. And this layering produced both the distinctive visual patterns and the unique combination of hardness and flexibility that made these weapons so prized. What made this technique particularly elusive to outsiders was not that it violated any fundamental laws of metallurgy, but rather that it required years of accumulated knowledge, an understanding of subtle variations in ore quality, precise control of furnace temperatures without modern thermometers, and an intuitive sense of timing that could only be developed through extensive practice and often remained unwritten, existing instead as embodied knowledge passed from master to apprentice through demonstration and correction. Deep in southeastern Turkey, beneath the rolling hills of the Fertile Crescent, archaeologists have uncovered a structure so ancient and sophisticated that it fundamentally rewrote our understanding of human civilization itself. A limestone temple complex called Göbekli Tepe that dates back nearly 12,000 years to a time when, according to conventional wisdom, humans were still living as scattered hunter-gatherers with no capacity for monumental architecture or organized labor. Yet here stands undeniable evidence of massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing 7 tons, arranged in circles with intricate carvings of animals and abstract symbols, crafted with remarkable precision by people who supposedly lacked the fundamental requirements for such undertakings, namely settled agriculture, social hierarchy, and permanent settlements. The psychological mechanism that allowed early researchers to dismiss this impossibility involved what we might call temporal prejudice, an almost automatic assumption that human progress moved in a single, inevitable direction from simple to complex, from nomadic to settled, from spiritual to practical, and therefore any evidence contradicting this neat narrative must be either misunderstood, misstated, or simply too extraordinary to accept. The builders of Göbekli Tepe possessed something far more profound than we initially granted them, a capacity for collective vision and shared purpose that emerged not from the pressure of agricultural surplus or state organization, but from something deeper within human nature itself, a drive to create meaning and mark the sacred landscape that required no written language, no formal government, and no permanent cities. Yet somehow motivated hundreds of people to haul massive stones across difficult terrain and invest generations of labor in a place that served primarily spiritual rather than practical functions. What persists despite our mounting evidence is a lingering discomfort with this realization, a subtle resistance to acknowledging that our ancestors possessed capabilities and sophistication that contradict our comfortable theories about progress, suggesting that the story of civilization is far messier, more cyclical, and less deterministic than we have long believed, and that the gap between what we imagine ancient peoples could accomplish and what they actually did remains one of archaeology's most humbling revelations. The temples themselves may have served as gathering places for dispersed hunter-gatherer communities during seasonal migrations, suggesting that monumental architecture arose not from the need to control surplus resources, but from the human impulse to create shared spaces where meaning could be collectively constructed and transmitted across generations. High in the arid plateau of southern Peru, stretching across nearly 900 square kilometers of barren desert landscape, exist enormous geometric figures and animal designs etched into the earth with such precision and scale that their true purpose remained hidden for centuries, visible only from the air. Creating one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries about why an ancient civilization would invest such tremendous labor into creating art that could never be properly observed from the ground where they lived and worked. The Nazca culture, flourishing between roughly 100 BC and 800 AD, created these massive lines by removing the reddish pebbles that covered the desert floor to expose the lighter ground beneath, producing stark white linear designs that included perfect trapezoids, spirals, and recognizable depictions of animals such as monkeys, spiders, hummingbirds, and whales, some stretching longer than football fields, yet remained essentially invisible to their creators except from elevated positions or in fragments. The psychological impulse that drives humans to create grand monuments and artworks operates on multiple levels simultaneously, blending practical resource management with spiritual and ceremonial significance, suggesting that the Nazca people may have created these lines as part of ritualistic pathways for processions, as astronomical calendars marking seasonal changes and celestial events important to agricultural cycles, as territorial markers declaring ownership and cultural identity across the landscape, or as offerings to deities and supernatural forces believed to inhabit the sky and observe human behavior from above. The monumental scale and invisible from ground nature of these creations suggest a profound belief system centered on celestial observation and communication with higher powers, a conceptual framework where creating something of tremendous effort and scale that could only be perceived by the gods themselves represented an act of profound devotion and spiritual significance that transcended practical utility. Yet today, despite decades of archaeological study, satellite imaging, chemical analysis, and theoretical modeling, no single explanation has achieved universal acceptance among scholars, and the true meaning remains fragmentary and contested, allowing the Nazca lines to persist as one of humanity's most captivating unsolved puzzles, a testament to how civilizations can create enduring enigmas that transcend time and technology, continuing to inspire wonder and speculation precisely because their original meaning has become irretrievably obscured by history. The ancient Egyptian embalming process represents one of humanity's most elaborate and methodical responses to the universal human fear of death and bodily decay, a practice that unfolded across thousands of years with remarkable consistency and ritualistic precision. When a person of significance died in ancient Egypt, their body would be transported to a specialized structure called the Ibu, or place of purification, where skilled practitioners called embalmers would begin a 70-day transformation that combined practical preservation techniques with deeply spiritual ceremonial acts. The process commenced with the washing of the corpse in natron-rich water, followed by the critical step of removing internal organs through careful incisions made along the left flank, after which the brain was extracted through the nasal passages using long bronze hooks, a procedure that seems brutal to modern sensibilities, yet was executed with anatomical knowledge that speaks to generations of accumulated expertise. The removed organs, including the lungs, stomach, intestines, and liver, were carefully placed into canopic jars that would accompany the deceased into the afterlife, while the heart was left undisturbed within the chest cavity, as the Egyptians believed this organ housed the soul and intelligence of the individual. The body cavity was then filled with natron, a naturally occurring salt compound found abundantly in the Egyptian deserts, which possessed extraordinary desiccating properties that drew moisture from the tissues and arrested the decomposition process with scientific efficiency. This natron treatment lasted approximately 40 days, transforming the flesh into a preserved state that could endure for millennia, after which the body would be wrapped in linen strips that had been treated with resins and adhesives, layer upon layer, until the entire form was encased in a protective textile cocoon. The psychological mechanism underlying this elaborate ritual stemmed from the Egyptian religious belief system, which held that preservation of the physical body was absolutely essential for the soul's continued existence and journey through the underworld, a concept so fundamental to their worldview that no expense, effort, or time could be considered excessive in service of this goal. The practice reflected a deep human anxiety about annihilation and oblivion, transformed into action through a framework of religious cosmology that rendered the preservation of the dead body not merely optional but cosmically necessary for eternal survival. Within the walls of Alexandria during the 3rd century before the Common Era stood one of humanity's most ambitious repositories of knowledge, a place where scholars from across the Mediterranean world deposited their most precious intellectual treasures, scrolls written in Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Hebrew, and countless other languages, all meticulously catalogued and preserved in what would become the ancient world's greatest center of learning. The Library of Alexandria contained somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 papyrus scrolls, though the exact number remains shrouded in historical uncertainty, covering subjects ranging from mathematics and astronomy to medicine, philosophy, drama, and the administrative records of kingdoms long forgotten. These were not mere books in the modern sense, but rather fragile rolls of papyrus, some dozens of meters long, requiring specialized knowledge to handle and read, many of which represented the only existing copies of works by ancient authors whose names and contributions would otherwise have vanished completely into the darkness of time. The psychological mechanism driving such an institution lay in the fundamental human recognition that knowledge itself possesses intrinsic value beyond immediate practical application, and that civilization advances through the accumulation, preservation, and transmission of intellectual achievements across generations. The library represented an early expression of what would become the scientific method and the democratization of learning, the notion that understanding the natural world and human experience should be organized systematically and made accessible to scholars regardless of their origin or social status. Yet despite this noble vision of preservation and enlightenment, the library's collection was ultimately lost to history through fire, invasion, and the simple passage of centuries. And we have normalized this catastrophic loss by treating it as an inevitable consequence of ancient times rather than examining what it reveals about how fragile our accumulated knowledge truly remains. Even in our modern era of digital storage and redundancy, we remain vulnerable to similar catastrophes: server failures, format obsolescence, and the selective censorship of information, reminding us that the Alexandria Library's fate was not merely an ancient tragedy, but rather a cautionary template that continues to unfold whenever societies neglect the infrastructure required to preserve what they claim to value most. Deep within the Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University rests one of history's most bewildering documents, a bound vellum manuscript approximately 240 pages in length, filled with meticulously rendered illustrations and text written in an alphabet that has resisted decipherment for more than 5 centuries. A mystery so profound that scholars have devoted entire careers to attempting to unlock its secrets, without ever reaching a definitive conclusion about its true nature or meaning. The manuscript, believed to date from the 15th century based on careful analysis of its materials and construction techniques, contains elaborate drawings of unidentifiable plants, peculiar astronomical diagrams, naked figures bathing in pools connected by intricate piping systems, and zodiacal illustrations that suggest connections to alchemy or medieval medicine. All accompanied by flowing script in an unknown language that follows consistent grammatical patterns and repetition that indicate intentional composition rather than random marks. The document's linguistic features have been analyzed through statistical methods, frequency analysis, and cryptographic techniques by mathematicians, linguists, and intelligence specialists trained in code breaking. Yet the manuscript refuses to yield its secrets, defying every conventional approach to translation and creating an almost gravitational pull on the human mind that compels us to solve what may ultimately be unsolvable. What makes the Voynich manuscript so psychologically compelling is not merely that it is encrypted, for encrypted texts can eventually be decoded with sufficient time and computational power, but rather that it seems designed to mock our fundamental assumptions about how written language functions, how knowledge is organized, and what it means for something to be meaningful at all. Our brains are evolved to recognize patterns, to find meaning in apparent chaos, and to solve puzzles presented to us, yet this manuscript presents a challenge that may be precisely calibrated to frustrate these instincts, offering just enough coherence to suggest genuine communication while remaining fundamentally illegible. The persistence of our fascination with the manuscript, despite 4 centuries of failed decryption attempts, reveals something profound about human psychology. We become increasingly obsessed with mysteries in direct proportion to the amount of attention and effort already expended on them, a phenomenon sometimes called the sunk cost fallacy, where we continue investing cognitive and emotional resources into unsolvable problems because we have already invested so much. One of the most enduring mysteries surrounding the construction of Stonehenge involves the practical mechanics of how massive sarsen stones, some weighing as much as 50 tons, could have been transported across the Wiltshire landscape from quarries located nearly 20 miles away during the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods. The prevailing archaeological consensus suggests that ancient peoples employed a combination of wooden sledges, rolling logs, ropes crafted from plant fibers, and potentially even water transport along the River Avon to move these colossal megaliths from their extraction, points to the monument's final location on Salisbury Plain. The logical framework behind this transportation method relies on principles of leverage, momentum, and communal labor organization, where hundreds of workers moving in coordinated fashion could overcome the immense friction and gravitational resistance presented by stone blocks of such extraordinary mass and dimension. Experimental archaeology has repeatedly demonstrated that with sufficient manpower, adequate rope technology, and properly prepared pathways, even the heaviest stones could be shifted incrementally across considerable distances through sustained effort and ingenuity, suggesting that the ancients possessed both the technical knowledge and social infrastructure necessary to accomplish such monumental feats without requiring supernatural intervention or lost advanced technologies. Yet despite these logical explanations supported by scientific recreation and engineering analysis, the persistent cultural fascination with alternative theories involving impossible transportation methods, astronomical alignment requiring precise knowledge beyond the period's understood capabilities, or even extraterrestrial assistance continues to captivate contemporary imagination. Reflecting a deep-seated human tendency to attribute accomplishments of ancient peoples to factors beyond ordinary human capacity, rather than accepting the profound power of organized labor, accumulated knowledge, and determination that characterized our ancestors' relationship with their physical environment and collective purpose. This underestimation of ancient ingenuity persists partly because modern observers, accustomed to mechanized solutions and individual specialization, struggle to conceptualize the mobilizing power of societies where communal construction projects represented central expressions of cultural identity, spiritual devotion, and collective achievement, making the marshalling of thousands of workers for years-long endeavors not merely possible, but culturally compelling. Deep within the ancient libraries of Mesopotamia, there exists a document of extraordinary peculiarity that has puzzled scholars for centuries, a text known as the Sumerian King List, which purports to chronicle the reign of kings across vast stretches of time with a mathematical precision that defies historical comprehension. This ancient cuneiform inscription, preserved on clay tablets and surviving in multiple copies, presents a genealogy of Sumerian rulers that begins long before what we would consider the dawn of written history, listing king after king with their reign lengths recorded in years, decades, and sometimes centuries that stretch far beyond any reasonable human lifespan, suggesting that these early rulers lived for periods of time that seem to belong more to myth than to documented reality. The document itself, composed sometime around the 21st century before the Common Era, appears to have been created as an attempt to establish legitimacy for contemporary rulers by connecting them to an unbroken chain of authority that supposedly extended back through the mists of primordial time, creating a narrative of continuous kingship that provided historical weight and divine sanction to whoever held power at the moment of the list's composition. The psychological mechanism underlying this curious document lies in a fundamental human need to establish continuity and legitimacy through historical narrative, a deep-seated desire to prove that authority flows from ancient sources and that power has not been seized arbitrarily, but rather inherited through an unbroken line of succession that stretches backward through time, becoming ever more impressive and awe-inspiring the further back it reaches. By attributing impossibly long reigns to ancient kings, the Sumerians were not necessarily attempting deliberate deception, but rather engaging in a form of mythological thinking wherein the distant past was conceived of as fundamentally different from the present, a time when the gods walked among humanity, and when natural laws operated differently, when a king might genuinely rule for 10,000 years because time itself had not yet settled into its current rhythm. This conceptual framework allowed ancient peoples to reconcile their belief in a continuous cultural tradition with the observable fact that no one in their contemporary world lived for such extended periods, essentially creating two separate categories of time, mythological and historical, that operated according to entirely different rules. The ancient Maya civilization, flourishing across Mesoamerica from roughly 3,000 years ago through the classical period, developed one of history's most sophisticated and mathematically precise calendar systems, an achievement that remains deeply puzzling to modern scholars who continue to grapple with understanding how such accuracy was obtained without telescopes or advanced astronomical instruments. The Maya tracked time using multiple interlocking calendars simultaneously, each serving distinct ceremonial, agricultural, and astronomical purposes, and the most famous of these systems, the long count calendar, operated on a cycle of approximately 5,125 years, measuring time from what the Maya believed was the mythological creation date of the current world. What makes this system extraordinary is not merely its complexity, but the profound philosophical worldview embedded within it. For the Maya conceived of time itself not as a linear progression, but as cyclical and regenerative, with each completion of a calendar round representing both an ending and a beginning, a concept fundamentally different from how many modern cultures perceive temporal flow. The 260-day Tzolk'in calendar, often called the ritual calendar, interwove 13 numbers with 20 named days, creating a pattern that repeated exactly 52 times before completing a full cycle. And this number 52 held special significance for the Maya, who believed that the world itself had been destroyed and recreated multiple times at intervals matching this sacred cycle. The 365-day Hob calendar tracked the solar year and agricultural seasons, and when layered with the Tzolk'in, these two calendars aligned only once every 52 years, an event the Maya celebrated as a new fire ceremony, a momentous occasion when they believed the world was renewed and granted another cycle of existence. Archaeological evidence reveals that Maya priests possessed remarkable astronomical knowledge, recording the movements of Venus with an accuracy that varied by only hours over centuries, and they documented lunar cycles, planetary motions, and eclipse predictions with precision that suggests generations of careful observation and mathematical refinement passed down through priestly lineages. The psychological mechanism underlying this achievement lay in the Maya's profound conviction that understanding and tracking celestial patterns granted them access to divine knowledge and allowed them to align human society with cosmic order, creating a powerful motivation for sustained observation and calculation across centuries, transforming what might otherwise seem like abstract mathematics into spiritually essential work. Deep within the mountainous reaches of the Inca Empire, a civilization that flourished between the 13th and 16th centuries developed one of history's most enigmatic recording systems, a three-dimensional device composed entirely of knotted cords called the Quipu, which served as the primary means of documentation, administration, and possibly even narrative communication across an empire that stretched over 2 million square kilometers and encompassed millions of subjects speaking dozens of different languages. The Quipu consisted of a primary horizontal cord from which hundreds of pendant strings hung downward, and upon these strings, knots were tied at specific intervals and positions, with the type of knot, its location along the cord, the color of the string itself, and the thickness of the cord all conveying distinct information that could be read and interpreted by specially trained Quipu readers known as Quipucamiocs. Spanish conquistadors who arrived in the 16th century encountered these devices being used for everything from census records and taxation documentation to military logistics and resource management. Yet they viewed them with suspicion and often destroyed them, regarding them as pagan artifacts incompatible with Christian European record-keeping traditions that relied exclusively on written language and alphabetic symbols. The psychological mechanism behind the Quipu's sophistication lies in humanity's fundamental drive to externalize memory and create systems of representation that transcend the limitations of individual human cognition. As societies scale in complexity, they necessarily develop increasingly elaborate methods of storing and retrieving information. And the Incas, despite never developing a written alphabetic system, created something arguably more flexible and three-dimensionally complex. Allowing them to encode quantitative data, hierarchical relationships, and potentially qualitative information through a system that did not require literacy in a traditional sense, but instead demanded specialized training and cultural transmission of knowledge. What remains remarkable is how thoroughly this system was suppressed and nearly lost to history, with the Spanish conquest resulting in the destruction of countless quipus and the erasure of the knowledge required to read them. And even today, with renewed scholarly interest and archaeological investigation, we can only partially decipher these ancient records, suggesting that entire layers of Inca administrative and possibly literary complexity remain beyond our reach. A permanent gap in human understanding created not by the passage of time, but by deliberate cultural erasure. For over 2,000 years, scholars and explorers have pursued the elusive island of Atlantis, a civilization that Plato described in his dialogues as an advanced society that sank beneath the ocean in a single day and night, and the search for its actual location has spawned countless theories, expeditions, and interpretations that range from the Mediterranean Sea to the Americas, each one attempting to transform a philosophical allegory into a historical reality that can be mapped, excavated, and proven. The most prominent location theories place Atlantis in the Mediterranean, particularly near Santorini and the Minoan civilization, where the volcanic eruption of Thera around 1500 before the Common Era devastated the Bronze Age societies in the region and left behind geological evidence of catastrophic submersion, making it a geologically plausible candidate for Plato's narrative, while other researchers have proposed locations in the Atlantic Ocean itself, the Black Sea. Off the coast of Spain near the Pillars of Hercules, Cyprus, Crete, and even locations outside the classical world entirely, including the Caribbean, the Azores, and various sites throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, each theory supported by archaeological findings, geological surveys, or interpretive readings of Plato's original text. The psychological mechanism driving this persistent search appears rooted in humanity's fundamental desire to locate the physical manifestation of myths, transforming abstract stories into concrete historical events that validate our need for tangible proof and connection to legendary histories, while simultaneously reflecting our fascination with lost knowledge and advanced ancient civilizations that supposedly possessed wisdom or technology now forgotten. Plato wrote Atlantis as a cautionary philosophical tale about hubris and the dangers of imperial overreach. Yet despite scholars repeatedly noting that the dialogue contains internal inconsistencies and philosophical markers indicating its fictional nature, the search continues unabated, fueled by the romanticization of sunken civilizations and the tantalizing possibility that somewhere beneath the waves lies undiscovered evidence waiting to revolutionize our understanding of human history. What persists is not merely a historical curiosity, but a cultural phenomenon wherein the desire to believe outweighs the evidence against it, and each new geological discovery, each reinterpretation of ancient texts, each technological advancement in deep-sea exploration reignites hope that this time, finally, we might locate the lost island and solve one of history's greatest mysteries. Deep beneath the earth near the city of Xi'an in China lies one of history's most magnificent archaeological discoveries, a vast underground army of thousands of terracotta soldiers standing in perfect formation, created over 2,000 years ago to serve the first emperor of unified China in the afterlife. Yet surrounding this monumental achievement exists a persistent and haunting legend that has captivated researchers and the public imagination for decades. A legend concerning a deadly poison that was allegedly used to seal the tomb and protect its treasures from grave robbers, a poison so potent and so carefully applied that it supposedly remained lethal across millennia, waiting in the darkness to strike down any intruder who dared breach the emperor's final resting place. The historical record provides tantalizing hints about this alleged toxin, with ancient texts and historical accounts suggesting that mercury or other poisonous compounds may have been incorporated into the burial chamber itself, possibly coating the walls or mixed into substances within the tomb, creating an environment of toxic vapor that would prove immediately fatal to anyone attempting to desecrate the sacred space. And this concept made extraordinary sense within the context of ancient Chinese imperial practices, where elaborate mechanisms and supernatural protections were considered essential elements of protecting a ruler's eternal kingdom from disturbance or violation. Yet the psychological mechanism that sustains this legend operates on a far deeper level than mere historical documentation, for it speaks to our profound human need to believe that power and majesty transcend death itself, that an emperor's authority could extend beyond his mortal existence to command obedience even from those who came centuries after his reign had ended. The notion that poison could lie dormant and deadly for thousands of years transforms the tomb from a mere repository of artifacts into an active, malevolent force, a spatial entity that remains vigilant and dangerous across the gulf of centuries, capable of enforcing its master's will from beyond the grave through methods both physical and seemingly supernatural. In the spring of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy searching for a lost goat stumbled upon caves nestled in the cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea, and within those ancient chambers, he discovered clay jars containing leather scrolls that would eventually transform our understanding of biblical texts and early religious history. Yet for decades, many of these extraordinary documents remained hidden from public view, sequestered in private collections, locked away in museum vaults, and controlled by small groups of scholars who jealously guarded access to their contents. The Dead Sea Scrolls represent one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, containing biblical manuscripts dating back nearly 2,000 years, as well as texts describing the beliefs and daily practices of an ancient Jewish sect, possibly the Essenes, who lived in isolation near the shores of that salt-filled body of water. However, the fragmented nature of the scrolls and the deliberate restrictions placed upon their study created a situation where entire portions of humanity's religious and intellectual heritage remained obscured from the scholarly community and the general public for an extraordinarily long period. The psychological mechanism driving this concealment operated through several interconnected layers. First, the legitimate concern that hasty or careless handling of delicate 2,000-year-old documents might cause irreparable damage, which justified initial protective measures. Second, the deeply human tendency of those granted exclusive access to maintain their elevated status and authority by controlling information and remaining the sole interpreters of these texts. And third, the complex religious and political implications embedded within the scroll's contents, which might challenge certain theological assumptions or institutional positions held by various religious authorities. Yet what began as reasonable conservation practices and scholarly caution gradually transformed into something far more problematic, a system where secrecy itself became normalized and self-perpetuating, where entire generations of researchers found themselves locked out of materials essential to their disciplines, where the justifications for continued restriction seemed to evaporate even as the restrictions themselves remained firmly in place. Deep in the ancient Greek countryside, near the small town of Eleusis, one of the most carefully guarded secrets of the ancient world unfolded in darkness and ritual silence, drawing thousands of initiates across centuries who swore absolute secrecy under penalty of death, their lips sealed so completely that despite abundant historical references to the Eleusinian mysteries, the actual content of what transpired within those sacred halls remains largely unknown even to modern scholars. The rituals centered around the cult of Demeter, goddess of grain and agriculture, and her daughter Persephone, whose mythological abduction into the underworld and seasonal return became the framework for an elaborate initiatory experience that combined theatrical performance, chemical alteration of consciousness through ergot-derived substances mixed into sacred barley drinks, elaborate pageantry involving torchlit processions, and profound psychological manipulation designed to simulate a journey through death and rebirth. The initiates, ranging from slaves to emperors, entered small chambers where trained priests guided them through orchestrated experiences of darkness and light, fear and comfort, disorientation and sudden revelation, creating powerful emotional and neurological states that profoundly altered their perception of mortality, meaning, and their place within the cosmos. The psychological mechanism underlying the mystery's power operated through the deliberate manipulation of altered consciousness, combined with social pressure, group conformity, and the human tendency to assign tremendous significance to experiences that carry social weight and exclusivity, particularly when those experiences involve sensory deprivation, chemical influence, dramatic lighting, and authoritative figures confirming that one has undergone genuine spiritual transformation. This potent combination created genuine subjective experiences of transcendence and mystical insight that felt absolutely real and meaningful to initiates, regardless of whether any objective spiritual truth undergirded them, and the secrets remained protected not merely through fear, but through the initiate's own psychological investment in believing they had accessed genuine mysteries worth protecting. Deep within the rainforests of Mesoamerica, scattered across the landscape of what is now Mexico, lie some of the most enigmatic sculptures ever created by human hands. Massive stone heads carved from single blocks of basalt that weigh as much as 50 tons, featuring distinctly African characteristics that have puzzled archaeologists and captivated the popular imagination for generations, with their full lips, broad noses, and unique facial features standing in stark contrast to what we might expect from pre-Columbian American civilizations, prompting countless theories and speculation about their true origins and meaning. The Olmec people, who flourished between roughly 1500 and 400 BCE, created these monumental heads as representations of their most powerful leaders and divine beings. Yet the specific purpose of each sculpture remains partially shrouded in mystery, with researchers suggesting they may have served as territorial markers, religious monuments, or commemorative effigies of revered ancestors whose importance to their society warranted such extraordinary expenditure of labor and resources. The mechanisms driving our fascination with these heads stem from a fundamental human tendency to impose familiar patterns onto the unfamiliar, to seek connections between distant cultures, and to imagine grand narratives of contact and influence where perhaps only coincidence and convergent artistic evolution exist, combined with our psychological need to explain anomalies within established historical frameworks. Even when those explanations stretch credulity and ignore the sophisticated local context of Olmec civilization. Over decades, pseudo-historical narratives have persisted despite extensive archaeological evidence demonstrating that the Olmec possessed the knowledge, resources, and artistic traditions necessary to produce these sculptures independently. Yet these alternative origin stories continue to circulate in popular media and entertainment, enduring because they appeal to our sense of wonder and our desire for hidden mysteries. Reflecting a curious paradox where we simultaneously celebrate human achievement across all cultures while unconsciously defaulting to assumptions that extraordinary accomplishments must have external explanations, rather than acknowledging the remarkable capabilities of ancient peoples who engineered civilizations without the tools we consider necessary today. In the early 16th century, an Ottoman cartographer and admiral named Piri Reis created what would become one of history's most enigmatic and debated navigational charts, a parchment map that somehow depicted coastlines and geographical features with startling accuracy despite being created centuries before modern surveying techniques and satellite imaging became available to mapmakers worldwide. The map, discovered in 1929 in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, shows the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and various Atlantic islands, rendered with such precision that it has sparked decades of speculation about ancient knowledge and lost civilizations, prompting researchers and enthusiasts to wonder how a medieval cartographer could have possessed such detailed information about lands that the official historical record suggests were not yet fully explored or mapped by European standards. Piri Reis himself documented his sources, mentioning that he consulted ancient maps and charts, including those allegedly derived from the Library of Alexandria, creating a chain of attribution that extends backward through time and invites questions about what geographical knowledge ancient peoples might have possessed and preserved through successive generations of scholars and navigators who understood the world's true dimensions far better than conventional histories suggest. The mechanism underlying the fascination with this map operates through our profound human attraction to mysteries that seem to suggest hidden knowledge and forgotten capabilities among our ancestors, combined with a deep skepticism toward mainstream historical narratives that can sometimes feel incomplete or deliberately obscuring of inconvenient truths that might complicate our understanding of human progress and development across millennia. Yet despite numerous scientific analyses confirming that Piri Reis likely consulted earlier maps and navigational records available to Ottoman scholars, and despite rational explanations accounting for both his accurate renderings and his obvious errors and distortions, the map continues to inspire theories of ancient global exploration and lost maritime civilizations, suggesting that once a historical artifact becomes wrapped in the language of mystery and possibility, it persists in our collective imagination regardless of how thoroughly we explain or debunk the more extravagant claims surrounding it. This phenomenon reveals something essential about how we process historical evidence. When a map contains both demonstrable accuracy and unexplained elements, we tend to construct narratives that privilege the mysteries over the explanations, transforming a skilled cartographer's reasonable work into a cipher for ancient wisdom we wish to recover. Deep within the Archaeological Museum of Heraklion on the island of Crete, there rests one of the most perplexing artifacts ever discovered, a ceramic disc no larger than a human palm that was unearthed in 1908 from the Minoan Palace of Phaistos. And upon its surface are stamped 45 distinct symbols arranged in a spiral pattern that descends from the outer edge toward the center in a mesmerizing geometric progression that immediately captivated scholars and continues to perplex them more than a century later. The disc itself dates back approximately 3,700 years to the Middle Bronze Age, yet the meaning of its inscribed message remains entirely unknown despite countless attempts by linguists, cryptographers, and academic institutions to decode its purpose. And this profound mystery has spawned an almost mythological status around the object itself, transforming it from a simple pottery artifact into a symbol of lost knowledge and ancient intelligence. The psychological mechanism underlying our obsession with the Phaistos disc stems from what researchers call the allure of the undeciphered text, a phenomenon whereby the human mind becomes increasingly drawn to puzzles that resist solution, experiencing a particular form of intellectual magnetism that grows stronger the more resolute the mystery proves to be, as if the very inscrutability of the symbols activates our deepest cognitive drives toward pattern recognition and meaning-making. We perceive the Phaistos disc not merely as an object but as a message, a deliberate communication from an ancient civilization reaching across millennia to speak directly to our modern consciousness. And this interpretation fundamentally shapes how we engage with it, despite having no evidence whatsoever that the symbols were ever intended to convey linguistic information rather than serving decorative, ritualistic, or purely administrative purposes. The disc persists in our collective fascination precisely because it offers no closure, no definitive interpretation that would allow us to file it away in our mental libraries and move forward. And so it remains suspended in a state of perpetual enigma, neither confirmed to be a written language nor proven to be something else entirely. Existing in a liminal space between meaning and mystery that satisfies our hunger for ancient secrets, while simultaneously frustrating our desire for comprehension. Yet perhaps this very irresolution constitutes the disc's greatest significance, for in refusing to yield its secrets, it reminds us that not all ancient wisdom need be deciphered to be valued, and that sometimes the most profound truths reside not in the answers we uncover, but in the questions that compel us to look deeper into both the past and ourselves. Deep within the archaeological record of medieval Europe lies one of history's most enigmatic metallurgical achievements, a sword that appears suddenly in the 9th century Viking world and seems to possess qualities that should not have been possible given the technological constraints of the era. The Ulfberht sword, identifiable by the distinctive marking plus sign Ulfberht plus carved into its blade, represents a level of iron purity and steel consistency that wouldn't be reliably replicated in Europe for another 1,000 years. Yet here it existed. Wielded by Norse warriors who seemingly possessed knowledge of advanced smelting techniques that remain partially mysterious even to modern materials scientists who have examined their crystalline structures under microscopes and marveled at their composition. These blades were not crude iron implements, but rather sophisticated products that demonstrated carbon content levels and homogeneous distribution patterns, suggesting either exceptional ore sourcing from distant regions or an advanced understanding of crucible steel production that may have been imported from the Islamic world through extensive trade networks that connected Scandinavia to the Mediterranean and beyond through intricate routes of commerce and cultural exchange. The mystery deepens because the Ulfberht swords represent only a fraction of Viking blade production, existing alongside numerous inferior examples, suggesting that either the technique was jealously guarded by a small cadre of master smiths whose knowledge died with them, or the materials required came from a source that eventually became inaccessible, leading to the eventual disappearance of this superior weaponry from the archaeological record after the 11th century when the distinctive markings ceased to appear entirely. We find ourselves contemplating how a civilization could possess such remarkable technical capability and then seemingly lose it entirely, how knowledge so valuable could vanish so completely that later generations would struggle to understand or replicate what their ancestors had achieved with such apparent mastery and precision. Perhaps the most poignant testament to this lost mastery is that Viking sagas themselves make no mention of the Ulfberht sword's superior qualities, suggesting that by the time these stories were recorded in the 13th century, the weapons had already passed into obscurity, their legendary properties forgotten even by the descendants of those who had wielded them in battle, leaving us with only the silent testimony of corroded steel and faded markings to hint at a golden age of Viking metallurgy that remains forever beyond our complete understanding. Deep in the South Pacific, isolated on a small triangular island thousands of miles from any major landmass, stand nearly 900 massive stone figures known as Moai, facing inland toward the people who carved them centuries ago in what scholars believe was an act of profound spiritual devotion and ancestral veneration. These monolithic statues, some towering nearly 40 feet in height and weighing as much as 80 tons, were meticulously extracted from volcanic quarries using only stone tools, then transported across the rugged terrain to various ceremonial platforms called ahu, where they were positioned to watch over settlements and resources with their distinctive long faces and hollow eye sockets that once held coral and obsidian pupils. The sheer scale and precision of this undertaking, accomplished by a Polynesian population that arrived on the island around 1500 years ago with no wheels, no large animals, and no metal tools, represents one of archaeology's most compelling mysteries, because the evidence suggests that the resources required to construct, move, and maintain these figures eventually depleted the island's ecological capacity and may have contributed to the civilization's eventual collapse and cultural transformation. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears rooted in the human tendency to externalize spiritual beliefs into monumental physical forms, particularly when religious authority or ancestral reverence holds supreme cultural importance, driving communities to invest exponentially greater resources into increasingly ambitious projects as a form of competitive display between clan groups and as a mechanism for reinforcing social hierarchy and religious authority through visible demonstrations of collective labor and control over resources. What makes this cycle particularly self-perpetuating is that each new generation, having inherited a landscape already dominated by these towering ancestors, becomes psychologically conditioned to view such construction as normal and necessary, creating an expectation that each successive leader must commission equally impressive or larger monuments to maintain legitimacy and spiritual protection. Deep within the caves of Qumran, near the Dead Sea in what is now the West Bank, archaeologists discovered in 1952 a remarkable artifact unlike any other scrolls found among the Dead Sea collection. A scroll crafted not from the fragile parchment of animal skin or papyrus, but from pure copper, its surface inscribed with letters that had been carefully hammered into the metal itself, creating a permanent record that seemed designed to outlast centuries of decay and deterioration. The scroll contained what appeared to be a detailed inventory of treasure locations, listing gold and silver hidden throughout the region, including specific measurements and geographical references that suggested an enormous wealth waiting to be discovered, with quantities so vast that some scholars calculated the total value would far exceed the wealth of entire kingdoms, making this document potentially the most valuable treasure map ever created. The psychological mechanism that has captivated explorers and researchers for decades stems from our fundamental human attraction to hidden wealth and the romance of discovery, the idea that somewhere beneath the earth lie riches left behind by an ancient civilization, treasures placed there with such deliberation and care that they created this permanent copper record as proof of their existence. Yet despite intensive archaeological expeditions, ground-penetrating radar surveys, and decades of systematic searching guided by the scroll's cryptic descriptions, no significant treasure has ever been found, leading many scholars to theorize that the scroll might represent idealized wealth rather than actual buried treasure, or that the original caches were already removed in antiquity, or that the geographical references have become meaningless as the landscape itself has transformed over 2,000 years. What persists is a curious blend of hope and skepticism, where researchers and treasure hunters continue to examine the scroll with fresh eyes and new technologies, unable to fully dismiss the possibility that somewhere in some overlooked location, the treasures described on that ancient copper surface might still remain undiscovered, a testament to how compelling the promise of hidden wealth remains even when logic and evidence suggest the treasure may never have existed as described, or was long ago removed from its resting place. The Ark of the Covenant, that legendary wooden chest overlaid with pure gold and crowned with golden cherubim, has captivated human imagination for nearly 3,000 years. Yet its actual location remains one of history's most enduring mysteries, with serious scholars and amateur investigators alike proposing theories ranging from the mountains of Ethiopia to hidden chambers beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, to secret vaults in locations as distant as Ireland and Egypt. The historical record tells us that this sacred object, which according to biblical accounts contained the 2 stone tablets inscribed with the 10 Commandments, along with Aaron's rod and a container of manna, was housed within the inner sanctum of Solomon's temple until the Babylonian siege and destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, after which it seemingly vanishes from documented history, leaving behind only questions and speculation about what transpired during those crucial moments when the temple fell. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with the Ark's disappearance operates through several interconnected layers of human need and desire. There exists a profound human craving for tangible connections to our spiritual and historical past, a need to believe that sacred objects possess genuine power and meaning beyond mere symbolism, and perhaps most compellingly, an attraction to the idea that great mysteries still exist in our thoroughly mapped and documented modern world, secrets that have somehow eluded even our most sophisticated archaeological and technological capabilities. What makes the Ark's mystery so psychologically resilient despite lacking concrete evidence is that absence itself becomes evidence, transforming the very lack of discovery into proof that something remarkable must indeed be hidden, perhaps deliberately preserved by ancient keepers of wisdom who understood its power and danger. And this circular logic persists because it satisfies multiple human needs simultaneously. It allows us to believe in transcendence and meaning, provides adventure and mystery in an increasingly rationalized world, and offers the tantalizing possibility that we might someday encounter something that would fundamentally transform our understanding of history and spirituality. The persistence of these theories, despite centuries of intensive searching and archaeological investigation, reveals how human consciousness normalizes the idea that some truths are meant to remain hidden, that certain knowledge deserves protection from profane discovery, and that the greatest treasures are those that continue to elude us, suggesting that perhaps the search itself has become far more valuable than any possible discovery could ever be. Deep within the archaeological record of the Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished between 2600 and 1900 BCE across the regions of modern-day Pakistan and India, there exists a writing system that has resisted all attempts at decipherment for over a century, standing as one of humanity's most enduring mysteries and a humbling reminder of the limits of our interpretive powers. The Indus script appears on thousands of artifacts, including small rectangular seals made of steatite stone, pottery fragments, and ceremonial objects, each bearing carefully crafted symbols that number somewhere between 400 and 1400 distinct characters, depending on which scholars you consult and how strictly they define what constitutes a separate sign. Yet despite the efforts of linguists, archaeologists, and cryptographers who have devoted their careers to unlocking its secrets, the script remains fundamentally silent, its meaning locked away behind symbols that refuse to yield to conventional methods of analysis and comparison. The civilization itself appears to have been highly sophisticated, with planned cities featuring advanced drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and evidence of extensive trade networks stretching across ancient Asia, suggesting that the script was surely instrumental in recording information crucial to such organized society, yet whatever messages it contained have been lost to time. The frustration scientists experience when confronting the Indus script stems from several compounding factors that create a perfect storm of interpretive impossibility. Unlike other ancient writing systems such as Egyptian hieroglyphics or Sumerian cuneiform, the Indus script has produced no bilingual texts, no Rosetta Stone equivalent that might provide a key to translation by offering the same message in a known and readable language. The script appears suddenly in the archaeological record with no obvious precursor or evolutionary development visible in earlier cultures, making it nearly impossible to trace its origins or understand how it was constructed, and it seems to disappear completely when the Indus civilization itself mysteriously declined, leaving no descendants to carry forward the knowledge of how to read it. Furthermore, the texts themselves are typically very short, consisting of only a handful of symbols on any single artifact, which means there is insufficient material available for the statistical and linguistic analyses that scholars normally rely upon to crack unknown writing systems. Deep within the misty forests of ancient Britain, Ireland, and Gaul, there existed a priesthood whose intellectual traditions were so carefully guarded that almost nothing was committed to written form, a deliberate practice that ensured their teachings remained inaccessible to all but the most dedicated initiates who spent years, sometimes decades, in oral transmission and memorization. The Druids, as they were known to the Romans and Greeks who encountered them, possessed vast knowledge spanning astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, and what we might today call natural philosophy. Yet they chose to preserve this wisdom entirely through the spoken word and through direct teaching from master to student in sacred groves and forest sanctuaries. Archaeological evidence and classical texts suggest that Druids maintained an elaborate cosmology that integrated their understanding of celestial movements with terrestrial cycles, creating a comprehensive framework for interpreting the universe that influenced every aspect of Celtic society, from agricultural practices to political decisions and spiritual ceremonies. The psychological mechanism underlying this secrecy was multifaceted and profound, rooted in the understanding that knowledge itself constitutes power, and that the act of withholding information creates a necessity for intermediaries whose authority depends entirely on their exclusive access to hidden wisdom. By requiring candidates to undergo lengthy initiations and proving their worthiness before receiving advanced teachings, the Druids created a self-perpetuating system where their social position became indispensable, as common people depended upon them to interpret signs, predict seasonal changes, and guide both the spiritual and practical aspects of communal life. What remains fascinating is how thoroughly this secrecy succeeded in obscuring Druid knowledge from history itself, so that today we possess only fragmentary understanding drawn from the accounts of their enemies and the handful of references preserved in literature. Yet we somehow accept this enormous gap in our historical record as natural despite possessing vastly more detailed information about countless other ancient civilizations who were far less deliberate in hiding their achievements and beliefs. The irony deepens when we consider that the very success of their secrecy strategy, the fact that so little was written down, has paradoxically rendered them more mysterious and perhaps more influential in modern imagination than they ever were in historical reality, allowing us to project onto them whatever wisdom we ourselves seek to find. Nestled within the British Museum's collection exists an artifact of profound mystery, a Roman chalice created sometime between the 4th and 5th centuries that demonstrates an understanding of light manipulation so sophisticated that it remained inexplicable to modern science until merely decades ago. This vessel, known as the Lycurgus Cup, presents a paradox that has captivated researchers and philosophers alike. For when light passes through its jade-colored glass in certain directions, the cup glows a deep crimson red, as though filled with wine or blood, yet when that same light is redirected, or when the cup is illuminated from within, it transforms back to its original pale green hue. For centuries, scholars examined this object with bewilderment, unable to reconcile the apparent transmutation of color with any known principles of glassmaking or material science available to ancient artisans. The mechanism behind this extraordinary optical property remained shrouded in mystery until contemporary nanotechnology researchers began their investigations in the 1990s. Discovering that Roman craftspeople had inadvertently created colloidal suspensions of gold and silver nanoparticles within the glass matrix itself, particles so infinitesimally small that they interact with light at the quantum level in ways that produce this dichroic effect. The ancient artisans, working without microscopes or theoretical frameworks for understanding atomic structure, had nevertheless achieved through careful observation and empirical experimentation what would be considered a feat of sophisticated nanotechnology by modern standards. This realization forces us to confront the unsettling possibility that technological sophistication and scientific understanding do not always travel together through history, that ancient peoples may have possessed practical mastery over processes whose underlying principles remained entirely beyond their conceptual grasp, achieved through generations of accumulated trial and error, careful documentation of results, and the passing down of closely guarded trade secrets from master craftspeople to apprentices. The Lycurgus Cup thus becomes not merely a beautiful object, but a humbling reminder that the neat narrative we have constructed about technological progress moving steadily forward from ignorance to enlightenment may itself be a comforting fiction we tell ourselves, when the actual history of human ingenuity might be far more complicated, far more nonlinear, filled with moments of brilliance disconnected from broader scientific frameworks. Islands of sophisticated understanding surrounded by oceans of mystery and accepted limitation. In the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, nestled among rolling hills and ancient terraces, stands the temple complex of Baalbek, one of the most magnificent architectural achievements of the Roman world, yet beneath its grandeur lies a mystery that has puzzled engineers and archaeologists for nearly 2,000 years. The temple platform contains some of the largest stone blocks ever quarried and moved by human hands, with the most famous being the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, a limestone megablock measuring approximately 21 meters in length, 4.2 meters in height, and nearly 4 meters in depth, weighing an estimated 800 tons, a mass that exceeds the capacity of any known Roman construction equipment or methodology that historians can definitively reconstruct. What makes this achievement even more bewildering is that this stone, along with dozens of others of comparable or nearly comparable size, was transported from a quarry located nearly 1 kilometer away, through hilly terrain, and then precisely positioned as part of a massive retaining wall that would support the entire temple platform above it. The engineering required to accomplish this feat would theoretically necessitate a system of ramps, rollers, and an enormous coordinated workforce. Yet the archaeological evidence for such infrastructure remains conspicuously absent from the site itself. The psychological mechanism that sustains our acceptance of this feat lies in a peculiar human tendency to compartmentalize technological impossibilities when confronted with physical evidence that proves they occurred, creating a cognitive space where we can simultaneously believe something should be impossible while acknowledging that it demonstrably happened, which allows us to avoid the uncomfortable conclusion that our understanding of ancient capabilities might be fundamentally incomplete. We have normalized the mystery of Baalbek through repeated exposure and academic framing, discussing it in terms of lost knowledge and forgotten techniques, rather than confronting the possibility that our reconstruction of ancient engineering science might contain significant gaps. And in doing so, we have transformed one of humanity's greatest unsolved mysteries into merely another archaeological curiosity, filed away and accepted without the deeper investigation its existence demands. Beneath the volcanic ash of Mount Vesuvius, entombed for nearly 2,000 years, lie the villas of Pompeii, structures that have preserved within their walls an extraordinary archive of domestic life frozen in time. Yet many of these homes contain chambers and artifacts whose true purposes remain profoundly mysterious to modern archaeologists and historians who continue to study them with meticulous care. The Villa of the Mysteries, perhaps the most famous among these preserved dwellings, features an entire room decorated with elaborate frescoes depicting what appears to be a Dionysian ritual. Yet scholars remain genuinely uncertain about the actual ceremonial or religious significance of these images, whether they represent initiation rites, theatrical performances, or mystical practices that have left no written explanation for posterity. Within the walls of numerous Pompeian villas, archaeologists have discovered sealed chambers containing objects arranged in patterns that suggest intentional concealment, hidden niches filled with items of apparent value or significance, and architectural features that seem to serve no practical function, creating puzzles that invite endless speculation about the beliefs, fears, and secret practices of those who inhabited these spaces. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with these mysteries stems from the fundamental human desire to understand those who came before us, to penetrate the private spheres of ancient life, and to uncover the hidden motivations and beliefs that govern behavior in societies separated from our own by centuries of cultural evolution and transformation. We find ourselves drawn to the idea that behind closed doors, ancient people engaged in rituals and practices that they deliberately kept obscure, suggesting a continuity of human nature across epochs in which every civilization harbors secrets, maintains private beliefs, and preserves knowledge within select circles. Yet despite having access to extensive archaeological evidence, detailed written records from contemporary sources, and sophisticated analytical techniques, we cannot definitively solve these mysteries, and perhaps this inability itself has become normalized and even cherished, as the ambiguity allows us to project our own interpretations and fascinations onto these ancient spaces, creating narratives that fulfill our psychological need to find meaning in incompleteness, while simultaneously revealing more about our own contemporary preoccupations and anxieties than about the actual daily experiences of the people who lived in these villas centuries ago. Deep within the oral traditions and guarded knowledge of the Hopi people of the American Southwest lies a collection of prophecies said to be recorded on ancient stone tablets, artifacts so significant that their very existence has been shrouded in secrecy for centuries, known primarily through fragmentary accounts and the careful testimonies of Hopi elders who have maintained their confidentiality as sacred trust. These tablets, which some scholars and indigenous historians believe may date back hundreds or even thousands of years, are said to contain cosmological knowledge and predictions about the cycles of human civilization, including detailed accounts of past worlds that have been destroyed and recreated, and warnings about future periods of great upheaval and transformation that would befall humanity. The Hopi themselves describe these prophecies as depicting four worlds in succession, with humanity currently existing in the fourth world, a period characterized by increasing moral decline, technological advancement without wisdom, and environmental degradation, all of which serve as harbingers of an impending shift or cleansing that will usher in a new era. What makes these prophecies particularly compelling to the human mind is the way they seem to align with observable patterns in our modern world, as observers throughout history have noted uncanny correlations between ancient Hopi predictions and contemporary events including world wars, environmental crises, and social upheaval, creating a psychological loop wherein confirmation bias and pattern recognition reinforce belief in their validity. The mechanism at work here involves our deep human need to find meaning and order within chaos, to believe that ancient peoples possessed wisdom we have lost, and to interpret ambiguous or metaphorical language as specific prophecies about our time, transforming vague statements about cycles and renewal into precise predictions that feel personally relevant. Despite the absence of verified archaeological evidence for these specific tablets, despite the fact that no independent authentication has been established, and despite the acknowledged difficulty in translating or interpreting symbols that may be purely symbolic or mythological rather than predictive, the prophecies persist in popular consciousness as genuine artifacts of ancient knowledge, normalized through countless books, documentaries, and discussions that present them as established fact rather than disputed cultural narratives, allowing the mystery to deepen and the allure to strengthen with each retelling. Deep within the archaeological records of Bronze Age Crete lies one of antiquity's most fascinating architectural mysteries, the Labyrinth of Knossos, a sprawling palace complex that has captivated human imagination for thousands of years and continues to inspire wonder in those who study its intricate design and layout. The palace, built around 1700 BCE during the height of Minoan civilization, spread across an area of approximately 230,000 square feet, featuring a bewildering arrangement of corridors, chambers, storage rooms, and ritual spaces that seemed to turn back upon themselves in patterns that confused even the ancients themselves, leading to countless legends about the structure being deliberately designed as an inescapable maze. The Minoans, renowned for their sophisticated maritime trade networks and artistic achievements, created a building whose internal geography appeared almost intentionally disorienting to outsiders, with narrow passageways that shifted direction unexpectedly, staircases that descended into courtyards only to branch into multiple directions, and rooms that seemed to serve purposes both practical and ceremonial in ways that modern archaeologists still debate and attempt to fully understand. What made this design particularly effective was its hybrid nature, combining the genuine requirements of a palatial administrative center with what appears to be an almost deliberate commitment to spatial complexity that would have reinforced the power and mystique of the ruling elite who navigated its corridors with practiced ease. The psychological mechanism underlying such elaborate design centered on the principle of controlled access and information asymmetry, where those who understood the palace's true layout possessed significant social and political advantage over visitors, merchants, petitioners, and potential adversaries who would find themselves disoriented within its passages, unable to locate treasure chambers, administrative offices, or escape routes without guidance from those familiar with its secrets. This architectural strategy created a physical manifestation of power itself, transforming the building into an instrument of psychological control that communicated the superiority and mystical authority of Minoan rulers without requiring explicit violence or confrontation, as the building's very structure became a form of dominion. In the year 1936, during archaeological excavations near Baghdad in what was once ancient Mesopotamia, workers uncovered a series of peculiar clay vessels that would spark decades of scientific curiosity and historical debate. These artifacts, dating back approximately 2,000 years to the Parthian period, consisted of clay jars containing copper cylinders and iron rods, arranged in configurations that bore a striking resemblance to galvanic cells, the very foundation upon which modern battery technology is built. The discovery immediately prompted researchers to question whether ancient civilizations possessed knowledge of electrochemistry that modern scholarship had assumed was exclusively a recent invention. When filled with acidic solutions like vinegar or citric acid, these reconstructed vessels demonstrated the capacity to generate small electrical currents, leading some investigators to propose that the Baghdad battery, as it came to be known, served purposes ranging from medical treatments to electroplating of metals to religious rituals involving artificial stimulation. The psychological allure of this discovery operates through a fundamental human tendency to project sophisticated technological understanding onto ancient peoples, creating a narrative wherein our ancestors possessed hidden knowledge that civilization had somehow lost or suppressed over centuries. This mechanism persists because it satisfies a deep-seated desire to believe that advancement is not necessarily linear, that ancient wisdom might surpass modern achievements in certain domains, and that mysteries surround us regarding what truly transpired in antiquity. Despite the absence of definitive evidence linking these vessels to widespread practical applications, despite the lack of archaeological context confirming their actual use, and despite the reasonable explanations attributing them to simple religious or decorative purposes, the Baghdad battery has become normalized within popular discourse as evidence of ancient technological prowess. Scholars continue to debate whether these artifacts represent genuine electrical experimentation or merely coincidental design, yet the mystique surrounding them endures, suggesting that we remain captivated by the possibility that our understanding of history contains significant gaps, and that somewhere in the distant past, civilizations may have harnessed natural forces in ways we have yet to fully comprehend or acknowledge within mainstream historical narratives. Deep within the Longyu region of Zhejiang province in eastern China, there exists a remarkable network of ancient caves that have puzzled archaeologists and engineers for centuries, their construction methods remaining largely mysterious despite extensive study and analysis. These cavernous spaces, which number in the dozens and possibly over 100, were hand-carved from solid bedrock with meticulous precision, featuring uniform pillar spacing, perfectly leveled floors, and elaborately carved walls that demonstrate extraordinary mathematical understanding and engineering prowess that seems almost impossibly advanced for the methods presumably available at the time of their creation. The caves vary significantly in size, with some chambers reaching heights of over 20 meters and spanning areas that would require the removal of thousands of tons of stone, all apparently accomplished using only hand tools and human labor over indeterminate periods that scholars continue to debate with considerable disagreement about their chronology and purpose. The psychological mechanism that draws us to these structures involves our deep-seated need to understand our ancestors and reconcile their apparent limitations with evidence of their remarkable capabilities, creating a compelling tension between what we assume about ancient peoples and what the physical evidence suggests they actually accomplished. We have normalized a particular narrative about human progress and technological advancement that assumes a linear trajectory toward greater complexity and capability. Yet the Longyu caves seem to violate these comfortable assumptions by demonstrating engineering sophistication and organizational ability that required planning, mathematical precision, and sustained labor coordination on a scale that challenges our conventional understanding of pre-industrial civilization. Despite having extensive historical records from Chinese dynasties that should document such massive undertakings, the caves remain largely absent from official histories and inscriptions, a conspicuous silence that perpetuates their mysterious status and allows various theories to persist without definitive resolution, even as modern engineering analysis confirms the extraordinary technical achievement represented by their construction. The absence of definitive dating methods and the lack of archaeological artifacts clearly associated with the cave's construction further compound the mystery, leaving researchers to rely on stylistic analysis and geological evidence that often yields inconclusive or contradictory results. In the early 1930s, French anthropologists visiting the Dogon people of Mali in West Africa documented astronomical knowledge that seemed impossibly advanced for a culture without telescopes or written mathematical traditions. Knowledge that included detailed descriptions of Sirius, the brightest star in Earth's night sky, and particularly the existence of Sirius B, a white dwarf companion star that remains invisible to the naked eye and was not discovered by modern astronomy until 1946. The Dogon spoke of this invisible star with remarkable specificity, describing its extreme density, its orbital period around Sirius A, and they incorporated this knowledge into their cosmology, their religious rituals, and their understanding of celestial mechanics in ways that suggested centuries or perhaps millennia of accumulated observation and transmission. The mechanisms through which such knowledge might have been acquired and preserved within oral tradition remain the subject of considerable scholarly debate, with some proposing that the Dogon possessed an independent astronomical tradition developed through careful naked-eye observation and mathematical reasoning passed down through specialized priest classes, while others suggest that early European contact, missionary influence, or knowledge shared by traders might have introduced this information more recently than the Dogon oral accounts suggest. Yet what persists in popular imagination is often the more extraordinary interpretation, the notion that the Dogon possessed somehow alien knowledge or contact with advanced beings, a narrative that has taken root in popular culture despite the lack of credible evidence supporting such dramatic claims, and this persistence reveals how we unconsciously embrace mysteries that seem to validate our sense that ancient peoples possessed secret wisdom beyond our rational understanding. Even as we simultaneously overlook the remarkable achievements in mathematics, astronomy, and engineering that documented historical sources clearly attribute to these same ancient civilizations without requiring supernatural explanation, suggesting that the allure of hidden knowledge satisfies a psychological need that transcends logical consistency or the actual historical record we possess. The Dogon case thus serves as a mirror reflecting our own biases about knowledge and its sources. We find it easier to imagine ancient peoples receiving wisdom from the stars than to recognize how sustained observation, mathematical insight, and cultural memory might accomplish the same result through entirely terrestrial means, a preference that perhaps says more about modern skepticism toward human potential than it does about the actual capabilities of past civilizations. Deep in the Italian peninsula, nestled between the Tiber River and the Arno River in what we now call Tuscany, there once flourished a civilization whose written language remains one of history's most profound mysteries, a testament to how completely a people and their means of expression can vanish from human understanding despite leaving behind thousands of inscriptions carved into stone and painted upon pottery and mirrors. The Etruscans, who dominated central Italy from roughly the 8th century before the Common Era until their gradual absorption into the Roman Republic around the 1st century before the Common Era, possessed their own distinct alphabet, their own grammatical structures, and their own way of encoding meaning that seems to belong to an entirely different linguistic family than the Latin languages that would eventually dominate Europe. We can read the individual letters of Etruscan inscriptions with relative ease because their alphabet is known to us, borrowed from Greek sources and adapted for their own purposes. Yet when we attempt to decipher the actual meaning of these carefully preserved words, we encounter a wall of incomprehension that refuses to yield to our conventional methods of linguistic analysis and reconstruction. The psychological mechanism that perpetuates this particular mystery lies in the gap between visual recognition and semantic understanding, the peculiar state of knowing what something says without knowing what it means, a condition that creates a kind of intellectual frustration that modern scholars have learned to accept as simply the permanent condition of Etruscan studies. We have perhaps 300 surviving Etruscan inscriptions and fragments, enough material to suggest patterns and propose theories about grammar and vocabulary, yet not enough to achieve the kind of comprehensive breakthrough that would allow us to reconstruct the full language with confidence. What makes this loss particularly poignant is the awareness that the Etruscans themselves clearly possessed literature, religious texts, historical records, and philosophical traditions that have been entirely obliterated, leaving us with only these fragmentary inscriptions, mostly short epitaphs and religious dedications that tell us remarkably little about the texture and depth of Etruscan civilization. The Romans, who absorbed Etruscan territory and eventually incorporated Etruscan peoples into their expanding empire, did not deliberately suppress the language so much as they simply superseded it with Latin, a process of cultural and linguistic replacement that felt natural and inevitable at the time, but which has left us forever unable to access the inner world of one of Europe's earliest advanced civilizations. High in the Peruvian Andes, overlooking the ancient city of Cusco, stands Sacsayhuaman, a fortress whose massive stone walls display a precision so extraordinary that visitors for centuries have struggled to comprehend how they were constructed without modern tools or machinery. The stonework here consists of enormous blocks, some weighing more than 200 tons, fitted together so tightly that a knife blade cannot pass between them. Yet these blocks were cut into irregular polygonal shapes that interlock with almost supernatural accuracy, creating a structural integrity that has allowed these walls to survive countless earthquakes that have devastated the colonial buildings constructed nearby with European techniques. The largest stones tower nearly 9 meters high, and the wall extends for approximately 300 meters, constructed in 3 parallel rows that climb the steep hillside with such geometric precision that engineers studying the site have found themselves baffled by the level of surveying knowledge and mathematical understanding that would have been required to accomplish such a feat using only stone tools, bronze implements, and human labor. Yet the Inca civilization that built this monument between the 15th and 16th centuries left no written records explaining their construction methods, which creates a cognitive dissonance in the modern mind that seeks rational explanation. What makes this precision even more psychologically perplexing is that the builders chose to use these irregular, puzzle-like shapes rather than simply quarrying rectangular blocks, suggesting they possessed not only advanced mathematical knowledge, but also a sophisticated understanding of load distribution, stress points, and structural engineering principles that should not have existed in a civilization without written language, without wheeled vehicles for transport, and without the kind of formal institutional knowledge systems we associate with such technological achievement. This gap between what we observe and what we believe should be possible creates a persistent fascination because we have normalized the assumption that precision engineering requires industrial technology. Yet Sacsayhuaman demonstrates that human ingenuity, meticulous planning, and generations of accumulated practical knowledge could achieve results matching or exceeding structures created with machines. Challenging our presumption that technological sophistication must follow a linear progression tied to specific tools, rather than emerging from patience, observation, and mathematical insight applied across countless hours of careful labor and refinement. Deep within the mountainous terrain of ancient Greece, perched upon the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the sanctuary of Delphi held a reputation as the most important oracle in the classical world, a place where the priestess known as the Pythia would enter a trance-like state and deliver prophecies that would shape the fates of nations, guide military campaigns, and influence the decisions of kings and common citizens alike. The Pythia, typically an older woman of humble origins chosen for her spiritual susceptibility, would descend into an underground chamber known as the Aditon, where she would sit upon a sacred tripod positioned directly above a chasm believed to emit vaporous gases rising from the earth itself. And once she inhaled these fumes and entered her visionary state, she would begin to speak in ecstatic utterances, convulsing and shrieking as priests and attendants would interpret her incoherent words into cryptic, often ambiguous prophecies that people traveled from across the Mediterranean to hear. The mechanism behind this phenomenon appears to have been rooted in both geological and psychological factors, as modern geological surveys have confirmed that the location does indeed sit above fault lines where ethylene gas and other volatile compounds could have seeped upward, inducing altered consciousness, hallucinations, and a genuine physiological trance in whoever inhaled the fumes, while simultaneously the intense psychological expectation of divine communication. The cultural reverence surrounding the priestess and the ritualistic preparation would have created a powerful cognitive environment wherein any utterance, no matter how seemingly random or nonsensical, would be interpreted as containing profound spiritual meaning by those desperate enough to believe in it. What remains remarkable is how this system persisted for nearly 1,000 years, commanding respect and influence across the entire ancient world, despite the prophecies themselves being notoriously vague, often contradictory, and frequently wrong in their predictions. Yet people continued to journey to Delphi, continued to pay substantial sums for access to the oracle, and continued to structure their lives around prophecies that modern analysis reveals to be little more than chance utterances filtered through layers of interpretation and cultural projection, suggesting that humanity's hunger for guidance and certainty transcends the actual accuracy or validity of the source from which that guidance claims to come. Deep within the Temple of Hathor at Dendera in Egypt, there exists a limestone relief carved into the walls that has captivated the imaginations of alternative historians and pseudo-archaeologists for decades. A relief that depicts what appears to be a human figure holding an object that some have interpreted as an ancient electric light bulb, complete with what looks like a filament glowing within a bulbous chamber. This carved image, dating back approximately 2,000 years to the Greco-Roman period of Egypt, has become the centerpiece of a compelling yet scientifically unfounded theory, suggesting that the ancient Egyptians possessed advanced knowledge of electricity and illumination technology far beyond what conventional archaeology would allow us to believe. The theory proposes that these ancient peoples, possessed of mysterious wisdom lost to the ages, had somehow harnessed electrical power to light the inner chambers of their temples and tombs, and that this remarkable achievement has been deliberately obscured or forgotten by mainstream scholars unwilling to accept that ancient civilizations might have possessed technological sophistication rivaling our own understanding. The psychological mechanism underlying the persistence of this theory rests upon several deeply human cognitive tendencies that operate invisibly within our thinking, particularly our tendency toward pattern recognition, which causes our brains to automatically seek meaningful connections between disparate visual elements even when no actual relationship exists, and our powerful drive to believe that ancient peoples possessed secret knowledge and hidden wisdom. A romanticized notion that appeals to our desire for mystery and the unknown. We are also susceptible to the allure of conspiracy, the satisfying narrative that mainstream institutions deliberately suppress inconvenient truths, a framework that explains why the theory persists despite the straightforward archaeological consensus that the relief actually depicts the deity Aten or other religious iconography using visual metaphors familiar to ancient Egyptian artistic traditions. The reality of the carving becomes almost irrelevant when examined through the lens of how thoroughly this theory has become embedded in popular culture, in documentaries, in popular books, and in the collective imagination of millions who find the prospect of ancient electrical technology far more enchanting than the complex religious symbolism that scholars have carefully documented through years of comparative analysis. Deep within the Polynesian expanse of the Pacific Ocean lies Easter Island, a remote volcanic landscape whose isolation has preserved one of archaeology's most perplexing enigmas. The Rongorongo script, a system of written symbols that appears on wooden tablets and artifacts, yet remains almost entirely undeciphered despite centuries of scholarly attention. The script consists of hundreds of distinct glyphs arranged in a unique pattern called boustrophedon, where lines of text run alternately from left to right and right to left, a reading method that mirrors the turning of a plow across a field, and this unusual directional convention immediately separates Rongorongo from nearly every other known writing system in human history. When Dutch explorers first documented the script in 1722 during their brief contact with the island's inhabitants, they encountered fewer than 25 surviving tablets bearing these intricate carvings, and the indigenous knowledge of how to read and write the system had already largely vanished from the Rapa Nui people, lost somewhere in the cultural discontinuities and catastrophes that had reshaped island society over previous centuries. The psychological mechanism underlying our continued fascination with Rongorongo stems from the human brain's deep compulsion to decode patterns and unlock hidden meanings, a drive so fundamental that we find ourselves irresistibly drawn to mysteries that appear solvable, yet stubbornly resist every attempt at systematic decryption, much like an unsolved puzzle that tantalizes us with the possibility that just one more approach might finally reveal its secrets. Scholars have proposed numerous theories about Rongorongo's origins and meanings, suggesting connections to lunar calendars, genealogies, ceremonial chants, or proto-writing systems influenced by European contact. Yet none of these hypotheses has achieved widespread acceptance or provided a reliable framework for consistently translating the remaining texts. What renders this particular mystery so enduring is how we have normalized the incompleteness itself, treating the undeciphered Rongorongo tablets as though they represent something profound about human knowledge's limits rather than acknowledging them as perhaps relatively mundane administrative or ceremonial records, whose loss reflects only the ordinary fragility of all unwritten and written traditions across cultures facing disruption and displacement. Deep within the mountainous regions of what is now Bulgaria and Romania, the ancient Thracian people developed an elaborate system of religious ceremonies centered around the precious metal gold, treating it not merely as currency or decoration, but as a sacred conduit between the mortal and divine realms. Archaeological excavations have revealed thousands of golden artifacts buried in ritual contexts, including intricate vessels, ornaments, and ceremonial objects that were deliberately hidden or entombed alongside human remains, suggesting that the Thracians believed gold possessed transformative and protective properties that could facilitate the passage of souls into the afterlife and ensure safe transit through dangerous spiritual territories. The ritualistic practices surrounding these golden objects involved elaborate burial ceremonies where shamanic priests would anoint the bodies of deceased nobility with gold dust mixed with fragrant oils and herbs, creating a luminous coating believed to make the deceased invisible to malevolent spirits and visible only to benevolent celestial guides who would recognize the material's sacred significance. The psychological mechanism underlying this practice emerged from a fundamental human need to establish tangible connections with the intangible, to create physical representations of spiritual protection and cosmic order, and to impose meaning upon death through elaborate ceremonial acts that transformed the random chaos of mortality into a carefully orchestrated journey toward the divine. The Thracians observed how gold's immutable properties never corroded, never diminished, and never lost its lustrous beauty despite exposure to the elements, and they extrapolated from these observable qualities the belief that gold itself partook of eternal and unchanging divine nature, making it the perfect material through which to communicate with powers beyond human comprehension and understanding. What remains remarkable is how this ancient framework persists in modern consciousness despite our complete understanding of gold's chemical properties and its utter inability to influence spiritual or metaphysical realities. Yet across countless cultures and throughout contemporary times, gold continues to hold symbolic power far exceeding its practical utility, suggesting that the human inclination to invest precious materials with transcendent significance operates at a level beneath rational analysis and continues to shape our behavior and beliefs even as we recognize its illogical foundations. Deep within the subtropical landscape of Florida lies a structure that defies conventional understanding of what a single person could accomplish without modern machinery, a sprawling monument of coral rock and stone that Edward Lycurgus constructed entirely alone over the course of 28 years, moving and positioning stones that weighed several tons, each with nothing more than simple tools and an unwavering determination born from heartbreak and artistic vision. The coral castle stands as a testament to human persistence and ingenuity, yet the methods by which Lycurgus managed this extraordinary feat remain largely undocumented and mysterious, inspiring decades of speculation about whether he possessed some secret technique that allowed him to manipulate massive blocks of stone with seemingly impossible ease, a mystery that has captivated engineers, archaeologists, and dreamers alike who have attempted to reverse engineer his methods through trial and error. What makes the coral castle method so psychologically compelling is that it represents the power of singular focus and determination, the idea that one person, fueled by purpose and emotional motivation, can achieve monumental results through persistent application of thought, patience, and unconventional problem-solving, suggesting that many of our perceived limitations might be self-imposed rather than genuinely insurmountable. The method operates on the principle that obsessive dedication combined with careful observation of mechanical advantage and leverage can overcome what appears to be impossible, that sweat equity and intellectual engagement with a problem can substitute for resources we believe we lack, and that the human body and mind are far more capable than modern comfort has taught us to believe. Yet despite the logical appeal of this concept, despite the evidence that stands before us in coral stone, contemporary society has largely normalized the assumption that meaningful accomplishment requires access to resources, technology, and institutional support, that individual effort alone cannot move mountains, and that attempting such feats is the province of the desperate, the delusional, or the historically primitive rather than the innovative and determined. A collective forgetting that perhaps costs us more than we can measure. Yet in moments when we encounter Lycurgus castle, whether in person or through photographs, we feel the weight of that forgotten possibility, a quiet reminder that the most formidable obstacle between us and our ambitions is often not circumstance but imagination, the willingness to ask not, how can this be done with what exists, but rather, what becomes possible if I refuse to accept that it cannot. Imagine standing on the deck of a double-hulled canoe, surrounded by nothing but the vast Pacific Ocean in every direction, with no compass, no sextant, no instruments at all, and yet knowing with absolute certainty the precise location of an island that lies hundreds of miles beyond the horizon, completely invisible to the naked eye. This was the reality for Polynesian navigators who, for over 2,000 years, traversed the largest ocean on Earth with a sophisticated wayfinding system that remains one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. These master navigators relied on what they called wayfinding, a complex methodology that integrated intimate knowledge of star positions throughout the night sky. The subtle patterns of ocean swells created by distant islands, the behavior of birds and fish, the color and temperature of water, wind patterns, and cloud formations that revealed hidden land masses far beyond visual range. They memorized detailed mental maps of hundreds of islands and their relative positions, creating three-dimensional spatial knowledge that existed entirely in the mind, passed down orally through generations of rigorous training. The psychological mechanism underlying this extraordinary capability stemmed from a completely different relationship with observation and memory than what modern navigation relies upon, requiring the mind to develop an almost supernatural attunement to environmental cues that most people today would never notice or retain. These navigators trained from childhood to observe the ocean with every sense, to internalize patterns that contemporary humans have relegated to instruments and technology, and to develop a form of embodied knowledge where information became not something to be referenced externally but internalized as direct, intuitive understanding. What makes this achievement even more remarkable is how thoroughly this knowledge system was nearly lost and forgotten, suppressed during centuries of colonization when Western navigation methods dominated, yet has been deliberately revived and preserved by contemporary Polynesian communities who recognize the profound value and accuracy of their ancestral wayfinding traditions. Today, despite living in an age of GPS technology and electronic navigation systems that have made such mental mastery seemingly obsolete, there remains something profoundly moving about the fact that this knowledge persists, studied and practiced anew by those who understand that losing these ways of knowing represents more than just the disappearance of a navigation technique, but the erosion of human cognitive capacity and cultural identity. In the year 132 of the Common Era, during the Han Dynasty in China, a brilliant mathematician and astronomer named Zhang Heng created an extraordinary device that would revolutionize humanity's ability to detect earthquakes across vast distances, a technological achievement that remained unmatched for nearly 2,000 years. This remarkable instrument, known as the seismoscope, represented one of the most sophisticated pieces of engineering the ancient world had ever witnessed. Standing approximately 6 feet tall and fashioned in the shape of a bronze urn decorated with intricate patterns and mystical designs that reflected the astronomical knowledge of the time. The device operated on a principle of suspended balance and gravitational response, utilizing a delicate internal pendulum system that would detect the slightest tremor in the Earth and translate that invisible seismic energy into a visible, measurable response through an ingenious mechanical arrangement that predated similar European instruments by more than 17 centuries. Inside the bronze vessel, 8 dragon-shaped mechanisms were positioned at cardinal and intercardinal points, each one connected through a complex series of levers and catches to a central ball-catching system, so that whenever an earthquake occurred in any direction, the appropriate dragon would open its mouth and release a bronze ball that would fall into a waiting toad's mouth below with an audible chime, thereby announcing both the direction and approximate magnitude of the seismic event to observers in the capital city of Luoyang, who could thus receive news of distant earthquakes across the vast Chinese empire within hours rather than days or weeks. The psychological brilliance of Zhang Heng's design lay not merely in its mechanical sophistication, but in its recognition of an invisible phenomenon that humans could not directly perceive, and its transformation of that imperceptible force into something tangible, audible, and observable. thereby bringing order and predictability to natural disasters that had previously seemed entirely random and unknowable to the human mind. This conceptual mechanism represented a fundamental shift in how ancient peoples understood their relationship with nature itself, suggesting that the Earth's movements followed logical, detectable patterns rather than being purely expressions of divine wrath or cosmic chaos. And this notion persisted throughout Chinese scientific tradition for centuries, influencing how later scholars approached the study of natural phenomena with instruments and systematic observation rather than superstition alone. Deep within the underground chambers of ancient Rome, initiates of Mithras gathered in spaces called Mithraea, conducting rituals shrouded in such profound secrecy that even today, nearly 2,000 years later, scholars can only reconstruct fragments of what actually occurred within those dimly lit caverns, where the god of contracts and cosmic order was venerated by soldiers, merchants, and administrative officials who formed the backbone of imperial society. The initiation process itself involved 7 distinct grades of membership, each one supposedly granting the participant access to deeper mysteries and more closely guarded knowledge, with names like Raven, Bridegroom, Soldier, Lion, Persian, Runner of the Sun, and Father, each rank believed to correspond to different celestial spheres and planetary bodies in the Zoroastrian cosmology that fundamentally shaped Mithraic theology. Archaeological evidence suggests that initiates underwent baptism-like ceremonies involving the blood of bulls, participated in ritual meals of bread and wine that would later be reflected in Christian communion practices, and engaged in elaborate dramatic reenactments of Mithra's cosmic battle against the forces of darkness. Yet the precise theological meanings and spiritual purposes of these activities remain substantially unknown because the practitioners deliberately destroyed no written records, or alternatively, never committed their sacred knowledge to written form at all, leaving only architectural remains and symbolic imagery to guide modern interpretation. The psychological mechanism underlying this obsessive secrecy appears to have stemmed from several interconnected motivations. The desire to create an exclusive community with privileged access to cosmic truth, the attempt to preserve power and social cohesion by controlling who possessed dangerous sacred knowledge, the need to maintain mystery as a means of psychological transformation and spiritual elevation, and perhaps most importantly, the cultural understanding that sacred knowledge was fundamentally different from ordinary information and required protective barriers to maintain its transformative potency. Deep within the archaeological sites of Menon, Crete, scattered across the island like fragments of an untold story, lie thousands of inscribed artifacts bearing a writing system that has resisted decipherment for over a century. Linear A, as scholars have named it, represents one of humanity's most profound mysteries, a sophisticated script that flourished between approximately 1700 and 1400 before the Common Era, predating even the better-known Linear B by several centuries. The symbols appear on clay tablets, religious vessels, seals, and ceremonial objects, suggesting a complex administrative and spiritual society that possessed the organizational capacity to record their thoughts, transactions, and beliefs in written form, yet their words remain locked away from modern understanding. Thousands of inscriptions exist, providing ample material for analysis, and yet the language they encode continues to elude translation despite decades of scholarly effort and increasingly sophisticated computational analysis. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with Linear A stems from a fundamental human drive to understand the voices of the past, to feel connected across millennia to those who came before us, and the frustration of encountering evidence of intelligence, culture, and organization while remaining unable to hear what these ancients actually meant to communicate. It creates a peculiar cognitive dissonance, where we can observe the artifact, measure it, date it, and even sometimes guess at its context, yet the actual meaning remains perpetually out of reach, as if we are reading sheet music without knowing the language of melody. We have normalized this mystery by incorporating it into our popular culture and academic discourse as simply an unsolved puzzle, another strange chapter in humanity's vast history, yet this normalization itself represents a kind of surrender to the limits of human knowledge, an acceptance that some secrets of the past may genuinely remain secrets forever, that not every question possesses an answer waiting to be discovered, and that civilizations can leave behind evidence of their sophistication while maintaining an eternal silence about their inner lives and meanings. Yet perhaps this silence itself teaches us something valuable, that human civilization need not be fully legible to be fully real, that the Minoans' accomplishments in architecture, art, and trade stand as monuments regardless of whether we ever decode their written words, and that our inability to read linear A serves as a humbling reminder that understanding is not the same as significance, and that some cultures may have thrived in ways that required no translation across time. Beneath the rolling volcanic plains of Cappadocia in central Turkey lies one of the world's most extraordinary subterranean settlements, a vast underground city carved from soft, tough stone that once sheltered thousands of people in its labyrinthine passages and chambers, descending more than 200 feet below the surface in multiple levels that connect through narrow tunnels and vertical shafts, creating an entirely self-contained civilization hidden from the world above. Derinkuyu, whose name means deep well in Turkish, represents perhaps the most ambitious example of underground habitation ever constructed by human hands, with scholars estimating that it could have accommodated up to 20,000 residents during periods of occupation, featuring not merely crude caverns but sophisticated living spaces including kitchens, storage areas for grain and wine, communal gathering halls, stables for livestock, and even places of worship that suggest a complex and organized society thriving in complete darkness and isolation from the natural world. The city was carved gradually over many centuries, beginning as early as the 8th century before the Common Era, when Hittites and Phrygians first discovered that the region's geology allowed for relatively easy excavation. Though the most extensive development occurred during the Byzantine period, when Christian communities sought refuge from repeated invasions and religious persecution, by retreating into these protective depths, and transforming them into fortified havens where they could preserve their faith and culture away from external threats and dangers. The psychological mechanism underlying such an elaborate underground construction reveals something fundamental about human survival instinct and the organizational capacity that emerges when communities face existential threats. For the very act of carving such a city represents not merely a practical response to danger, but a profound psychological transformation wherein people accept a profoundly unnatural existence in total darkness and confinement. Working cooperatively across generations to create an alternative world that prioritizes safety and collective security above the basic human needs for sunlight, open space, and connection to the natural environment. In the shadowed workshops of ancient Egypt, situated along the fertile banks of the Nile River, where artisans labored under the watchful gaze of scribes and overseers, a remarkable transformation took place within the heat of kilns and furnaces that glowed like small suns against the desert night. The craftspeople of this civilization discovered that when they combined copper oxide, silica sand, and calcium carbonate, heating these raw materials to extraordinarily high temperatures within controlled environments, an entirely new substance emerged from the flames, one that possessed qualities never before seen in nature, a pigment of such vivid, luminous blue that it seemed to capture the very essence of the heavens themselves. This Egyptian blue, known to the ancients as the color most sacred and most precious, required knowledge of precise proportions and an intimate understanding of how heat could fundamentally alter matter at its deepest level, transforming mundane minerals into something transcendent and alive with color. The pigment held remarkable permanence, resisting fading under the intense Mediterranean and North African sun far better than organic dyes derived from plants or insects, and it became the visual language through which Egyptian artists communicated concepts of divinity, eternity, and royal authority on tomb walls and temple surfaces. What makes this achievement remarkable is that the ancient chemists, though they possessed no formal scientific framework as we understand it today, had essentially stumbled upon or deliberately engineered one of humanity's first synthetic pigments, a human-made creation rather than a natural discovery, demonstrating a sophisticated comprehension of material transformation that would not be matched in other parts of the world for thousands of years. Yet despite this extraordinary innovation, despite the technical mastery it represented, and the labor-intensive production methods required to create it consistently, Egyptian blue eventually faded from common use after the decline of pharaonic civilization, its secret methods lost to time and rediscovery, leaving us to wonder how such profound knowledge could be misplaced entirely, only to be painstakingly reconstructed by modern scientists through patient analysis of ancient pigment samples, teaching us that even our greatest achievements can slip through the grasp of human memory. Today, as researchers recreate Egyptian blue in laboratories, Using the same basic principles the ancients understood instinctively, we recognize it as a predecessor to the synthetic pigments that would eventually transform art and industry across the modern world, a humble beginning that whispers across millennia of human ingenuity and our endless drive to remake the materials around us. Across the vast steppes of ancient Central Asia, the Scythian people accumulated enormous quantities of gold artifacts that they buried with deliberate care in elaborate kurgans, or burial mounds, some of which contain treasures so immense that they rival the hoards of ancient kingdoms far more documented in historical records. These nomadic warriors and horsemen, who dominated the regions from the Black Sea to the borders of China between the 8th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, possessed a sophisticated understanding of metallurgy and craftsmanship that allowed them to create intricate animal-shaped ornaments, ceremonial vessels, and decorative plaques that showcased both technical mastery and deeply spiritual artistic sensibilities. The gold was not merely accumulated for wealth or display in the modern sense. Rather, it served as a fundamental expression of their cosmological beliefs, their connection to the divine, and their understanding of what would sustain their leaders in the afterlife, making these burial deposits sacred repositories of both material and immaterial culture that we are only beginning to fully comprehend. Archaeological excavations in Russia, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine have revealed mounds containing hundreds of kilograms of worked gold, yet many Scythian burial sites remain unexcavated or have been looted throughout centuries, meaning that the true extent of the gold stashes may never be completely known or studied by modern scholars. The psychological mechanism underlying this practice reflects a universal human impulse to provide for those we have lost, to ensure their dignity and status extends beyond death, and to demonstrate through tangible wealth the measure of their importance within the community and their anticipated standing in whatever realm awaited them spiritually. What persists as remarkable is how these burial practices reveal that the Scythians valued permanence and continuity so deeply that they entrusted their most precious materials to the earth itself, trusting that these objects would survive and maintain meaning across generations, a belief that has proven partially correct given that archaeologists continue discovering these treasures thousands of years later. The normalization of this practice within Scythian culture suggests a worldview fundamentally different from our own contemporary understanding of possession and value, one where the greatest wealth demonstrates itself not through display during life, but through the magnitude of what one releases at death, creating an inversion of our modern assumptions about how prestige and resources function within society. Archaeological evidence from the Carthaginian civilization, particularly from sites like Tophet in modern-day Tunisia, reveals a deeply unsettling practice that flourished from approximately the 8th to the 2nd century before the Common Era, wherein the Carthaginian people engaged in ritual child sacrifice as a religious and communal observance. The remains of thousands of cremated infants and young children have been discovered in designated sacred burial grounds, accompanied by votive offerings and inscriptions bearing the names of families who participated in these ceremonies, suggesting that this was not an isolated or hidden practice, but rather a normalized and institutionalized aspect of their religious life. The victims were typically between infancy and early childhood, though some evidence indicates older children were also sacrificed, and archaeological analysis reveals that these children were carefully selected, possibly even bred for this specific purpose, then ritually killed through methods including burning, drowning, or strangulation before their remains were placed in urns and interred in these sacred spaces. The driving force behind this phenomenon appears rooted in the Carthaginian religious worldview, wherein the most powerful deity Baal-Hamon demanded the ultimate expression of devotion and sacrifice from his followers. And as the civilization faced periods of military threat, famine, or existential crisis, the impulse to offer the most precious possession one could imagine, one's own child, intensified as a desperate theological transaction meant to secure divine intervention and favor. What is profoundly striking is how completely normalized this practice became within Carthaginian society, with wealthy families apparently competing to demonstrate their piety and loyalty through these sacrificial acts, suggesting that the psychological mechanism at work involved a complete inversion of parental instinct through religious framework, wherein the killing of one's child became recontextualized not as murder, but as the highest form of love and obedience to divine will. Even more remarkably, Carthaginian culture maintained this practice across centuries despite its obvious psychological cost and practical demographic consequences. demonstrating how deeply embedded such rituals can become when reinforced by religious authority and communal expectation, and how a civilization can simultaneously develop sophisticated mathematics, architecture, and commerce while perpetuating acts that seem incomprehensible to modern moral consciousness. The Great Sphinx of Giza stands on the Giza Plateau near Cairo, Egypt, a colossal limestone monument with the body of a lion and the head of a human, carved from a single bedrock formation approximately 4,500 years ago during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre in the 4th dynasty of Egypt's Old Kingdom. Across the centuries, this iconic structure has been subjected to relentless environmental forces, particularly water erosion, which has left visible marks upon its surface in the form of deep weathering patterns, vertical fissures, and significant degradation of its limestone blocks, most notably affecting the body of the creature, where rainfall runoff and groundwater seepage have carved pronounced grooves and channels into the stone. Geologists and archaeologists have observed that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx's body do not correspond uniformly to the amount of rainfall that the Giza region has received during recorded history, which suggests that much of this damage accumulated during wetter climatic periods that preceded the present arid conditions, likely during the Holocene epoch, when the Sahara region experienced substantially greater precipitation and moisture. The mechanism driving this peculiar observation involves the understanding that limestone, despite its apparent solidity and permanence, is fundamentally vulnerable to dissolution when exposed to slightly acidic water, whether from rainfall, groundwater, or atmospheric moisture, as the calcium carbonate that comprises limestone gradually dissolves through a chemical process that occurs invisibly over centuries and millennia, leaving behind the visible scarring and deterioration we observe today. The enigmatic aspect of the Sphinx's water erosion lies in how we have come to accept and normalize the monument's degradation despite our full awareness of the cause, rarely discussing with appropriate urgency how the very forces that shaped it continue to threaten its existence, how modern urban development in Cairo has altered groundwater patterns beneath the Giza Plateau, and how pollution and rainfall creates increasingly acidic conditions that accelerate the very dissolution processes that carved those ancient channels into the stone. We continue to marvel at this structure as if it exists in a static state, frozen at the moment of its discovery by modern archaeology, when in fact the Sphinx remains engaged in an ongoing dialogue with the elements, slowly surrendering its form to the same water that first shaped human civilization along the Nile River Valley thousands of years ago. Deep within the jungles of Cambodia stands Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument in the world, a temple complex so precisely constructed that its architectural alignments suggest a sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics that would not be fully appreciated by modern science until centuries after its completion in the 12th century. The entire temple is oriented with remarkable accuracy toward the west, an unusual choice for a Hindu temple dedicated to Vishnu, and this westward orientation aligns perfectly with the equinox sunset at a specific time of year, creating a phenomenon where light floods through the temple's corridors and illuminates sacred chambers in a carefully orchestrated display of astronomical knowledge. The precision of these alignments extends beyond simple directional orientation, as the temple's passageways, towers, and galleries form a sophisticated three-dimensional representation of the cosmos as understood by Khmer civilization, with the central tower representing Mount Meru, the cosmic center of the universe, while the surrounding structures correspond to celestial bodies and their movements throughout the seasons. This alignment system functioned as both a religious statement and a practical astronomical calendar, allowing the priests and astronomers of Angkor to track the passage of time with accuracy that modern measurements have confirmed to within mere minutes of error across centuries of observation. The psychological mechanism that allows us to accept such sophistication from ancient peoples involves reconciling our modern assumptions about technological progress with the clear evidence that human ingenuity and mathematical capability existed in full measure long before the Industrial Revolution. Yet we persistently frame these achievements as anomalies rather than as indicators that ancient civilizations possessed systematic knowledge comparable to our own. We have normalized the idea that progress moves in only one direction, forward from past ignorance to present enlightenment, so that when we encounter evidence of precise astronomical knowledge in places like Angkor Wat, we interpret it as either lucky coincidence, mysterious lost knowledge, or the work of impossibly advanced visitors, rather than acknowledging that the human mind and human observation have always been capable of extraordinary feats when properly organized and motivated. In the year 1999, in a small region of eastern Germany near the town of Nebra, two men with metal detectors uncovered something that would fundamentally challenge our understanding of ancient astronomical knowledge and Bronze Age capabilities. What they found was a bronze disc approximately 32 centimeters in diameter, covered with a striking pattern of celestial bodies crafted from tin and gold leaf, depicting stars, the sun, and what many scholars believe to be the Pleiades star cluster, along with what might represent the phases of the Moon or the Milky Way itself. This artifact, dating back approximately 3,600 years to around 1625 before the Common Era, revealed that the people of prehistoric Europe possessed a sophisticated understanding of the night sky that fundamentally contradicted the prevailing academic narrative about the intellectual capabilities of Bronze Age societies. The disk itself functions as a planetarium frozen in time, a tangible representation of how ancient peoples observed, recorded, and attempted to make sense of the celestial sphere that hung above them, suggesting that astronomical knowledge was not something that developed gradually and exclusively within the Mediterranean civilizations or the Near East, but rather flourished independently across diverse human populations. What makes this discovery psychologically compelling is how it forces us to confront our assumptions about progress and human capability, because the Nebra Sky Disc demonstrates that the accumulation of knowledge and the drive to understand our place in the cosmos operated on timescales far longer and across geographies far broader than our conventional historical frameworks suggest. Yet we persist in compartmentalizing this knowledge as exceptional rather than recognizing it as evidence of a universal human impulse toward understanding that has simply been fragmented and lost through the passage of time and the collapse of ancient societies. The Nebra Sky Disc thus stands as a poignant reminder that history is not a linear ascent from ignorance to enlightenment, but rather a series of peaks and valleys, of knowledge gained and lost, rediscovered and forgotten, a humbling testimony to the fragility of human accomplishment and the vast repositories of understanding that have dissolved into dust across the millennia. Deep within the archaeological record of Sardinia, an island in the Mediterranean that has guarded countless secrets across millennia, there exists a remarkable collection of bronze figurines that have puzzled scholars and captivated researchers for generations. These small, meticulously crafted figures, known as Neuragic bronzes, date back to the Neuragic civilization that flourished on Sardinia between approximately 1700 and 500 BCE, representing one of the most sophisticated Bronze Age cultures in the Mediterranean region. The figures themselves are extraordinarily detailed despite their diminutive size, often standing only a few inches tall, yet displaying an anatomical precision and artistic sophistication that suggests their creators possessed advanced technical knowledge and a deeply developed aesthetic sensibility. These bronzes depict warriors adorned with elaborate helmets and weapons, religious figures holding ritual objects, animals ranging from stags to boars, and abstract geometric forms whose purposes remain enigmatically unclear to modern interpretation. The Sardinian craftspeople employed a lost wax casting technique of remarkable complexity, suggesting they understood metallurgy at a level that rivals the most advanced civilizations of their contemporary world. Yet these figures remained largely unknown to the broader Mediterranean consciousness, hidden away in this island location where they were preserved by geographical isolation and cultural continuity. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with these objects relates to the fundamental human need to witness evidence of human creativity and intention across vast temporal distances, to recognize in these tiny bronze forms a direct connection to minds and hands that worked thousands of years ago with purpose and skill. When we examine a Sardinian bronze warrior, complete with shield and spear, we experience a peculiar cognitive satisfaction in recognizing universal human concerns transcending time. Yet simultaneously, we confront the unsettling reality that entire civilizations can achieve remarkable sophistication while remaining largely forgotten by the historical mainstream narratives that dominate our collective understanding. These objects persist in our consciousness because they force us to contemplate how incomplete our historical knowledge truly remains, how the familiar Mediterranean narratives centered on Greece and Rome have overshadowed equally complex and accomplished cultures that developed in relative geographical proximity, and how the accidents of archaeological preservation and scholarly attention have fundamentally shaped which ancient peoples we remember and which fade into obscurity. In the ancient settlement of Çatalhöyük, nestled within what is now modern-day Turkey, there existed a remarkable social organization that challenges our conventional understanding of hierarchical civilization. For the archaeological evidence reveals a community of approximately 8,000 people living in densely packed mud brick dwellings, where the absence of obvious power structures and monumental architecture suggests a fundamentally egalitarian approach to communal life. The physical layout of this Neolithic city, dating to approximately 9,200 years ago, demonstrates that homes were constructed with virtually uniform size and quality, suggesting that wealth accumulation and status differentiation were either absent or deliberately minimized within the social framework of this early urban center. The mechanisms underlying this unusual equality appear to stem from a collective decision to distribute labor equitably across the population, where tasks such as food production, tool manufacturing, and domestic responsibilities were shared among community members without apparent specialization into rigid class systems or occupational castes that would typically emerge in settlements of comparable size and complexity. The psychological foundations for maintaining such egalitarianism likely rested upon shared spiritual beliefs, communal religious practices centered around goddess worship and fertility rituals, and a cultural emphasis on group identity that superseded individual ambition or personal accumulation of material goods beyond what was necessary for survival and basic comfort. What makes the persistence of this social structure particularly intriguing is that archaeological evidence indicates this way of life endured for approximately 1,500 years, despite the absence of any logical mechanism that would prevent the emergence of hierarchical authority, elite classes, or centralized leadership that characterizes virtually every other known civilization of comparable size and duration throughout human history. The remarkable resilience of Çatalhöyük's egalitarian structure suggests that inequality and hierarchy are not inevitable evolutionary outcomes of human settlement and organization, but rather conscious social choices that can be deliberately resisted and prevented through cultural values, religious ideology, and communal enforcement of sharing principles that discourage the hoarding of resources or the accumulation of individual power and status that inevitably leads to social stratification. Deep within the rose-red mountains of what is now Jordan, the ancient Nabatean people engineered one of the most sophisticated hydraulic systems the ancient world had ever known, a testament to human ingenuity that allowed a thriving city to flourish in an environment that should have rendered it utterly uninhabitable. The city of Petra, carved directly into sandstone cliffs, faced a fundamental challenge that would have defeated lesser civilizations. The harsh desert climate received minimal rainfall, yet the city needed to sustain thousands of inhabitants, provide water for gardens and livestock, and maintain the elaborate rituals and daily practices of a prosperous trade hub. Nabateans responded by constructing an intricate network of channels, cisterns, dams, and pipes that captured every precious drop of water that fell upon the surrounding plateaus, directing it through carefully engineered routes that minimized evaporation and loss. These waterways were cut into the stone with remarkable precision, featuring subtle gradients that allowed gravity alone to move water across vast distances, and they were sealed with a hydraulic plaster that prevented seepage and contamination. The system included large underground cisterns carved from the bedrock itself, some capable of holding hundreds of thousands of liters, ensuring that water could be stored during the scarce rainy season and rationed throughout the long, dry periods. What drove this extraordinary achievement was the psychological understanding that water was not merely a resource, but the very foundation of civilization, and the Nabateans possessed the conceptual framework to see potential where others saw only barren rock and impossibility. They understood that through patience, careful observation of natural water flows, and methodical engineering, they could transform their environment's greatest liability into an asset that would secure their prosperity for centuries. Yet today, despite our modern technological advantages and vastly greater knowledge of hydrology and engineering, we continue to squander water in ways the Nabateans would have found incomprehensible, dumping clean drinking water while others suffer from scarcity, seemingly having forgotten the fundamental lesson that these ancient people embedded in stone: that water is precious, finite, and worthy of our most careful stewardship and respect. The Nabateans' water system ultimately outlasted their civilization by centuries, continuing to function long after Petra's decline, a silent monument to engineering that transcends the empires it serves. A reminder that true legacy is measured not in monuments of stone alone, but in the invisible infrastructure of survival that we leave behind for generations we will never meet. Deep within the mountainous highlands of Peru, nestled among the ancient stone structures of Chavín de Huántar, lie the mysterious oracle chambers that once served as the spiritual and political heart of one of South America's earliest complex civilizations, a labyrinthine network of underground passages and ceremonial spaces that were meticulously designed to produce profound psychological effects on those who entered their shadowed depths. The Chavín culture, flourishing between 900 and 200 BCE, constructed these chambers with remarkable architectural precision, incorporating narrow corridors, chambers of varying heights, and most intriguingly, a sophisticated system of stone channels and acoustic pathways that would carry water and sound through the structure in ways that would have seemed almost supernatural to ancient visitors seeking communion with the divine. The most famous chamber contains the Lanzón, a lance-shaped granite monolith carved with an anthropomorphic deity figure standing at approximately 4.5 meters tall, positioned in the center of a cross-shaped chamber where priests would have stood in semi-darkness, their voices and the sounds of water echoing through the stone in ways that would have seemed to emanate from the deity itself, creating an overwhelming sensory experience designed to convince pilgrims that they were in the presence of a divine being speaking directly to them through the oracle. The psychological mechanism at work in these chambers operated through the clever manipulation of sensory deprivation, acoustic amplification, and architectural intimidation, where the narrow passages would force visitors to move slowly and carefully, building anticipation and anxiety, while the darkness would heighten all other senses, making echoes seem louder and more mysterious than they would in normal daylight conditions. And the priests who inhabited these spaces would have understood intuitively how to use voice projection, carefully timed water releases through the stone channels, and the movement of torchlight to create effects that would seem to transcend the physical world and suggest direct communication with supernatural forces. The Chavín oracle functioned as a mechanism of social control and political authority, where the priests who controlled access to the chambers and interpreted the messages that seemed to come from the deity would have wielded enormous power over the surrounding communities, directing decisions about agriculture, warfare, and religious practice. While the visitors who emerged from these chambers would carry with them profound psychological experiences that would reinforce their belief in the power and legitimacy of both the oracle and the priests who served it. One of the most monumental cities of the ancient world rose to prominence in central Mexico around the 1st century of the Common Era. Yet the identity of those who built Teotihuacan remains shrouded in mystery, so complete that archaeologists cannot definitively name the civilization responsible for its construction and development. The city itself stands as a testament to extraordinary organizational capacity and architectural knowledge, with its massive pyramids, particularly the Pyramid of the Sun and Pyramid of the Moon, arranged in precise geometric patterns along the Avenue of the Dead, suggesting a civilization possessed of advanced mathematical understanding and urban planning sophistication. The structures themselves, some reaching heights of over 200 feet, required the coordination of thousands of workers across decades, indicating a highly stratified society with centralized authority capable of marshaling enormous resources toward monumental projects. Yet despite the unmistakable evidence of this remarkable civilization's presence in the archaeological record, the written records that might have identified them, explained their origins, or described their beliefs were either never created in a form that survived or remain undeciphered by modern scholars. The psychological mechanism underlying our acceptance of this peculiar gap in historical knowledge involves a compartmentalization of understanding wherein we acknowledge the physical evidence as undeniably real, while simultaneously accepting that the human identity behind it has vanished beyond recovery, creating a strange cognitive space where we study the builder's accomplishments without knowing who they were. This paradox persists because the material evidence speaks so powerfully that it supersedes the absence of documentary evidence, allowing us to admire the work while remaining comfortable with our ignorance of the workers, a normalization that reflects how readily humans adapt to incomplete understanding when confronted with overwhelming archaeological presence. The city continued to grow and flourish for centuries, reaching its peak around 500 to 700 CE, eventually declining and being abandoned before the arrival of the Spanish, leaving behind a monumental puzzle that invites endless speculation about the identities of those who achieved such architectural magnificence. A mystery that transforms Teotihuacan into something almost supernatural in its grandeur precisely because it stands disconnected from the familiar narrative framework of named peoples and documented histories. During the Han Dynasty in ancient China, somewhere between the 2nd century before the Common Era and the 1st century after, a remarkable practice emerged among the wealthy and powerful elite, one that would endure for centuries as a testament to humanity's deepest fears regarding mortality and the afterlife. Jade burial suits, known as jade armor of immortality, were meticulously crafted garments constructed entirely from thousands upon thousands of small jade tiles, each piece precisely cut and shaped, then painstakingly sewn together using threads of gold or silver to create an elaborate full-body covering that would encase the deceased in a glittering, impenetrable shell. These suits required an extraordinary investment of resources, labor, and time, often taking skilled craftsmen years to complete a single garment, as each individual jade piece had to be carved with absolute precision to fit seamlessly with its neighbors, creating a protective layer that was simultaneously beautiful and profoundly functional in the eyes of those who commissioned them. The belief system underlying this practice was rooted in a deeply held conviction among the Chinese aristocracy that jade possessed extraordinary metaphysical properties, that it could preserve the body from decay, protect the soul's journey through the underworld, and ultimately grant the wearer a form of immortality, or at least ensure a peaceful and prosperous existence in whatever realm lay beyond death. This logic, while appearing supernatural to modern sensibilities, operated within a consistent worldview where the material properties of jade, its coolness, its hardness, its translucent beauty, were understood as direct manifestations of spiritual power and protective force that could literally shield a person from the corruption of death itself. Yet despite our contemporary scientific understanding that jade possesses no such preservative or metaphysical properties, that decomposition proceeds regardless of external covering, we continue to invest enormous resources in containment systems, elaborate coffins, and embalming processes, essentially perpetuating the same fundamental impulse that drove the Han Dynasty elite to construct their jade suits. Merely expressing it through different materials and different language, while the underlying human need to deny decay and extend some form of permanence remains as powerful and unexamined as it ever was. The pyramids of Nubia, constructed across the territories of what is now Sudan between approximately the 25th century and the 1st century BCE, represent one of the ancient world's most distinctive architectural achievements. Yet their true purposes remain subjects of scholarly debate and ongoing archaeological investigation that challenges many of the assumptions we have inherited about monumental construction in antiquity. Unlike their more famous Egyptian counterparts, Nubian pyramids were distinctly smaller in scale, more steeply angled in their architectural proportions, and distributed across multiple royal burial sites including Napata, Meroe, and other ceremonial centers throughout the Nubian kingdoms, suggesting that their functions extended beyond simple sepulchral monuments to encompass complex religious, political, and social dimensions that archaeologists continue to uncover through careful examination of burial chambers, inscribed texts, and material evidence. The prevailing contemporary understanding suggests that Nubian pyramids served primarily as elaborate tombs for royal individuals and members of the elite classes, functioning as permanent resting places designed to preserve the deceased and facilitate their transition to the afterlife according to Nubian religious beliefs that were influenced by but distinctly separate from Egyptian mortuary practices. Yet simultaneously, these structures appear to have served as territorial markers, symbols of dynastic power, and focal points for ritual ceremonies that reinforced social hierarchies and religious authority within Nubian society. Historians and archaeologists have gradually recognized that the interpretation of Nubian pyramids as merely derivative imitations of Egyptian forms reflects a problematic colonial-era perspective that diminished Nubian cultural achievements and failed to acknowledge the sophisticated adaptation and innovation that characterized Nubian civilization, leading contemporary scholars to propose that these monuments functioned as expressions of distinct Nubian religious cosmology. architectural ingenuity, and political autonomy rather than simple copies of foreign models. The psychological persistence of viewing Nubian achievements through the lens of Egyptian influence suggests how deeply embedded certain hierarchies of civilization remain in academic discourse and popular understanding. Despite substantial evidence demonstrating that Nubian kingdoms maintained independent trajectories of cultural development, artistic expression, and technological advancement that deserve recognition as autonomous contributions to ancient world civilizations. Deep within the limestone hills of southeastern Turkey lies Göbekli Tepe, one of humanity's oldest monumental structures, dating back approximately 9,500 years to the pre-pottery Neolithic period, and within its layered archaeological record rest the remains of individuals whose burials challenge everything we thought we understood about early human society and its relationship with death. The excavations conducted by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt and his team revealed that among the massive T-shaped pillars carved with intricate depictions of scorpions, snakes, and wild boars, human remains were not interred in the elaborate manner one might expect for such a significant ceremonial site, but rather were scattered, fragmented, and distributed throughout various occupation layers, suggesting that the dead were not buried with the reverence typically associated with monumental architecture. Yet the very presence of human bones in close proximity to these towering stone monuments indicates that the living maintained an intimate and recurring relationship with death and the deceased within this sacred space. The psychological mechanism underlying this pattern appears rooted in humanity's earliest attempts to establish order and meaning in the face of mortality, where the construction of monumental structures served simultaneously as expressions of community cohesion, spiritual aspiration, and a tangible means of anchoring the living to those who had passed, creating physical spaces where the boundary between the living and the dead became deliberately ambiguous and permeable. What persists throughout history, despite the absence of any rational necessity, is precisely this impulse to transform death from a private biological event into a communal architectural statement, a phenomenon we have so thoroughly normalized that we continue erecting monuments, building cemeteries, and designing memorial spaces with the same fundamental conviction that motivated those ancient people to arrange their pillars around scattered human remains, suggesting that this behavior reflects not mere superstition or primitive confusion, but rather a deep psychological need to create permanence where impermanence naturally dwells, to establish collective memory through physical form, and to declare through stone and arrangement that those who have died remain woven into the fabric of community life in ways that transcend the simple fact of their absence. Deep within the Australian continent, across deserts and forests and ancient riverbeds, there exists a cartographic system so intricately woven into the fabric of human memory and oral tradition that it operates almost invisibly to those unfamiliar with its mechanisms. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia developed what are known as songlines, a sophisticated method of encoding geographical, ecological, and spiritual information into narratives that are sung, danced, and transmitted across generations with remarkable precision. These songlines are not merely poetic descriptions of landscape features, but rather they function as comprehensive maps that contain detailed information about water sources, food locations, seasonal patterns, ceremonial sites, and the routes that connect distant territories across thousands of kilometers. A single songline might describe a journey across hundreds of miles, with each verse or musical phrase corresponding to specific landmarks, rock formations, or water holes that existed along the actual traveled path. The Aboriginal peoples would sing these songs while walking, and by following the melody and lyrics, they could navigate accurately through terrain that appeared featureless and hostile to outsiders, finding resources and maintaining their connection to ancestral lands with extraordinary reliability across vast expanses where written maps would have been impossible to create or carry. The psychological and mnemonic mechanism underlying this system operates through the natural human capacity to remember information when it is encoded in rhythmic, musical, and narrative forms rather than static visual representations. The human brain demonstrates remarkable ability to retain complex sequential information when it is set to melody, rhythm, and story, a phenomenon that explains why we remember song lyrics far more easily than we remember paragraphs of written text. By integrating geographical knowledge into sacred narratives and ceremonial performances, Aboriginal cultures created a system where practical navigation information became inseparable from spiritual practice and social bonding, meaning that the knowledge was reinforced continuously through ritual participation rather than requiring dedicated study. The combination of melody, movement, visual landscape recognition, and social ceremony created multiple neurological pathways for encoding and retrieving the same information, making the system extraordinarily robust and resistant to degradation across time and generations. What remains remarkable is how completely this sophisticated knowledge system was dismissed and devalued by colonial powers, who insisted that written maps and formal geographical documentation represented the only legitimate forms of spatial knowledge. Deep within the archaeological remains of the Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished between 2600 and 1900 BCE across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, there exists evidence of a water management system so sophisticated and so thoroughly planned that it challenges our understanding of ancient engineering capabilities. The cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa reveal not merely scattered wells or simple irrigation channels, but rather an integrated network of drainage systems, public baths, reservoirs, and water distribution infrastructure that suggests a civilization possessed of remarkable technical knowledge and organizational prowess. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro, measuring 12 meters in length and 7 meters in width, features a sophisticated drainage system with a corbelled arch that allowed water to flow away from the structure with precision, while the surrounding buildings were connected to underground sewage systems made of brick and clay that rivaled anything found in contemporary civilizations. The Harappan people constructed intricate terracotta pipes that carried water through their cities with deliberate slopes engineered to maintain proper flow, demonstrating an intuitive grasp of hydraulic principles that would not be systematized into formal science for thousands of years. Yet the psychological mechanism that allows us to encounter such evidence is our tendency to compartmentalize ancient achievement, maintaining a narrative wherein progress flows linearly from primitive to advanced, from simple to complex, thereby preventing the cognitive dissonance that would arise from acknowledging that civilizations separated from us by 4,000 years possessed technical mastery that we struggle to explain through our current frameworks. We normalize this contradiction by attributing Harappan hydraulic success to accident, to borrowed knowledge, or to simple practical necessity born from living in a river valley, rather than confronting the uncomfortable reality that engineering brilliance has emerged independently and repeatedly throughout human history, suggesting that our species has always possessed the capacity for remarkable innovation when driven by the fundamental human needs of water management and sanitation. The standardization of Harappan brick sizes and pipe diameters across different cities separated by hundreds of kilometers suggests not mere coincidence, but rather a deliberate engineering culture that valued consistency and reproducibility, principles we associate with modern scientific thinking, yet which clearly flourished in the 3rd millennium BCE. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, the great Aztec capital that once flourished on an island in Lake Texcoco, there stood structures of profound ceremonial significance that challenged the sensibilities of Spanish conquistadors who would later encounter them. Towers constructed entirely from human skulls bound together with mortar and wooden beams, rising like monuments to civilization's most sacred and intimate relationship with mortality itself. These towers, known as Tzompantli in the Nahuatl language, were not aberrations or acts of barbarism, as European observers would later characterize them, but rather architectural manifestations of a deeply coherent worldview in which death was not an ending but a transformation, a doorway through which the soul passed into another realm of existence where it would continue to serve the cosmic order. The Aztecs believed that the universe itself moved through cyclical ages, each one destined to end in catastrophe, and that only through the constant nourishment of the gods with sacred life force could the sun be persuaded to rise again each morning and the world be prevented from falling into eternal darkness. The skulls displayed on these towers represented warriors who had died in battle or on the sacrificial altar, individuals who had achieved the highest possible honor in Aztec society by offering their lives to sustain the continuation of existence itself, and their bones became monuments to courage and cosmic necessity rather than objects of horror or shame. Yet despite the logical consistency of this belief system within its own cultural context, despite the fact that thousands upon thousands of Aztec people understood and accepted the philosophical underpinnings of these towers as essential to survival and cosmic balance. The practice persisted in being viewed through the distorting lens of outsider incomprehension. An incomprehension that has calcified into historical narrative and shaped how we understand not just the Aztecs, but the very nature of what constitutes civilization and barbarism. We have normalized this othering, this dismissal of an entire cosmological framework as primitive or savage, allowing the towers themselves to fade from our understanding not as monuments to a coherent philosophy, but as curiosities of a dead and superseded culture, their existence rendered into something almost dreamlike and distant rather than a profound expression of a people's deepest spiritual convictions about the nature of existence, sacrifice, and the eternal renewal of the cosmos. Deep within the Norse sagas and medieval Icelandic texts lie references to a mysterious object called the Sunstone, a stone that Vikings allegedly used to navigate the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic when clouds obscured the sun and stars, enabling them to find their way across featureless ocean expanses where no landmarks existed to guide their longships toward distant shores. For centuries, this sunstone remained a legendary artifact lost to history, a mythical navigational tool that seemed too fantastical to be anything more than storytelling embellishment or poetic exaggeration by ancient scribes who sought to explain the seemingly impossible seafaring achievements of these Norse explorers. However, archaeological and scientific investigation in recent decades has suggested that the sunstone was almost certainly real, likely a crystal of Iceland's spar or calcite that possesses a remarkable optical property called birefringence, wherein the stone splits light into two polarized rays that vibrate in different planes, creating a visible double image when viewed at certain angles. When rotated in the sky toward the sun, even when obscured behind clouds or just below the horizon at extreme latitudes during summer months, this crystal would reveal the position of the sun through subtle changes in light polarization, a phenomenon invisible to the naked human eye but readily apparent when looking through the stone. The Vikings may have discovered this property through experimentation or accident, recognizing that these clear crystals held secrets about light itself that could be exploited for navigation across waters where traditional methods failed. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is that the Vikings developed this practical application of a sophisticated optical principle centuries before modern physics would explain the science underlying it. Yet they normalized its use without needing to understand polarization theory or quantum mechanics. They simply observed, tested, and trusted in the stone's mysterious ability, passing knowledge of it through oral tradition and cultural practice until the practice faded with the rise of the magnetic compass and other navigation tools. The sunstone persists in our collective imagination as evidence that ancient peoples possessed intuitive technological knowledge that operated outside formal scientific frameworks, a reminder that practical wisdom and experimentation can yield results long before theoretical understanding arrives to explain them, and that the boundary between myth and reality in ancient accounts is often far more permeable than we assume. In the arid and unforgiving deserts of what is now Jordan and southern Israel, the Nabatean people developed one of the most sophisticated water management systems the ancient world had ever witnessed, a network of techniques so ingenious that it allowed thriving cities to flourish in regions where rainfall was sparse and unpredictable, sometimes arriving only a handful of days each year. The Nabateans constructed elaborate systems of cisterns, channels, and underground aqueducts that captured every precious drop of water that fell from the sky, diverting runoff from wadis and seasonal torrents into carefully engineered reservoirs carved from stone, and they built intricate networks of terracotta pipes and plastered channels that guided water across vast distances with minimal loss to evaporation. What made their system truly revolutionary was not merely the infrastructure itself, but rather the psychological understanding they possessed about water scarcity and survival, recognizing that in desert environments, water was not simply a resource but the fundamental currency of existence, and that investing enormous labor and ingenuity into its capture and preservation represented an investment in the very continuation of their civilization. The logical mechanism behind their success lay in their ability to think systematically about a chaotic natural phenomenon, transforming unpredictable rainfall events into managed, stored supplies that could sustain populations through months of absolute drought, and they accomplished this through careful observation of hydrological patterns, understanding where water naturally pooled and flowed, and then amplifying those natural processes through human engineering. Yet what persists most fascinatingly about the Nabatean water systems is how they were sustained and expanded across centuries, not through any single dramatic innovation, but through a normalized cultural value placed upon water conservation and management, a collective understanding passed down through generations that treating water as infinitely abundant was not merely foolish but existentially dangerous, and so their descendants continued to maintain, repair, and expand these systems even when immediate survival seemed secure, embedding water consciousness so deeply into their society that the infrastructure became invisible, simply the way things had always been done, the background framework within which daily life unfolded. High in the Andes Mountains of Bolivia, at an elevation of roughly 12,500 feet above sea level, sits the ancient ruins of Tiwanaku, one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations to ever flourish in South America. And yet the archaeological record presents us with a profoundly puzzling question about how such an advanced culture could have developed and thrived at such an extreme altitude, where oxygen levels are significantly reduced and agricultural conditions are extraordinarily challenging compared to lower elevations, where other great civilizations chose to establish their centers of power and influence. The ruins themselves showcase remarkable engineering achievements, including precisely cut stone blocks fitted together without mortar, intricate astronomical alignments, and complex water management systems that suggest a population of perhaps 40,000 people or more at its height between roughly 1500 BCE and 900 CE. Yet the fundamental mystery remains about how the inhabitants managed to sustain such a large and organized society while dealing with the constant physiological stress and limitations that come with living at such a severe altitude, where human bodies require extended periods of acclimatization to function normally. Archaeological evidence indicates that the Tiwanaku people possessed advanced knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, textiles, and astronomical observation, suggesting cognitive abilities and organizational structures on par with or exceeding those of contemporaneous civilizations in other parts of the world. Which raises the logical question of how altitude itself could have constrained their development when they clearly possessed the intellectual capacity and technical knowledge to overcome such environmental obstacles through careful planning and adaptation. The psychological mechanism that perpetuates this mystery is the modern assumption that extreme altitude presents an insurmountable barrier to civilization development, an assumption rooted in our contemporary experience of altitude sickness and respiratory difficulty when we briefly visit such locations, causing us to project our own physiological vulnerabilities onto ancient peoples who likely experienced genetic adaptations and generational acclimatization that we cannot fully comprehend or replicate in our modern research. In the 1st century of the Common Era, in the bustling city of Alexandria, a Greek mathematician and engineer named Hero, sometimes called Heron, created what many consider to be the world's first steam engine, a device that would remain largely forgotten for nearly 2,000 years despite its revolutionary principles. The machine itself was elegantly simple in its construction, consisting of a hollow sphere made of bronze or brass that was mounted on a pair of pivoting supports, with 2 bent tubes or nozzles protruding from opposite sides of the sphere at its equator, and these nozzles were angled so that steam escaping from them would cause the entire sphere to rotate rapidly around its horizontal axis. Water was heated in a separate furnace below, and the resulting steam was conducted through a pipe into the sphere, where it built pressure until it could escape through the 2 nozzles. And as the steam rushed out tangentially from these openings, the reaction force caused the sphere to spin at remarkable speeds, creating a mesmerizing display of continuous rotation that seemed almost magical to observers of that ancient time. The psychological mechanism that allowed this invention to slip into obscurity lies in the context of ancient Mediterranean society, where mechanical advantage and labor-saving devices were not valued in the same way they would be centuries later during the Industrial Revolution, because slavery and cheap human labor were fundamental to the ancient economy, meaning there was no pressing economic incentive to develop and perfect technologies that could replace workers. Furthermore, the sheer ingenuity of the device itself may have worked against its practical adoption, as it was often treated as a curiosity or a novelty demonstration of scientific principles rather than as a serious tool for industry or transportation, and it was frequently described in the context of trick doors for temples or mystical automata that could amuse the wealthy and educated classes rather than as a machine with genuine productive potential. Rising from the flat landscape near present-day St. Louis, Illinois, stands Monk's Mound, the largest prehistoric earthwork in North America, a massive structure built by the Mississippian civilization between roughly 1,000 and 150 years ago. Yet the true purpose of this colossal mound and its surrounding complex of satellite mounds remains one of archaeology's most compelling mysteries. Wrapped in layers of speculation and incomplete evidence that continues to captivate scholars and dreamers alike. The sheer scale of Cahokia is staggering, with Monk's Mound alone covering 14 acres at its base and rising 100 feet into the air, constructed entirely by human hands moving earth basket by basket, a labor that would have required the coordination of thousands of workers over decades, suggesting a civilization of remarkable organizational power and shared vision. Yet what exactly drove this monumental ambition remains obscured by time and the loss of written records. Archaeological evidence suggests the mound served multiple functions simultaneously, acting as a ceremonial platform where religious rituals unfolded before gathered crowds, a residence for elite nobility who commanded both spiritual and temporal authority, an astronomical observatory where the movements of celestial bodies could be tracked and predicted to regulate the agricultural calendar, and possibly a fortification or defensive structure that provided strategic advantage and protection, creating a multivalent purpose that defies simple categorization. The psychological mechanism underlying such monumental construction likely stemmed from the human need to create permanent markers of cultural identity and spiritual significance, to build structures that would outlast individual lives and assert dominion over the natural landscape, transforming the earth itself into an expression of collective belief and social hierarchy that could be seen and felt across generations. What persists as remarkable is how this civilizational achievement has become almost forgotten in the broader consciousness, overshadowed by more publicized ancient wonders. Despite representing one of the most sophisticated urban complexes north of Mesoamerica, its true purposes perhaps known only to those who built it, remaining locked within the earthen slopes that still stand quietly beneath the modern American sky. Deep within the southwestern reaches of the Iberian Peninsula, in what is now modern-day Spain, there existed an ancient civilization known as Tartessos, flourishing between roughly the 9th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, leaving behind fragmentary inscriptions and mysterious linguistic remnants that scholars have spent centuries attempting to decode and understand. The Tartessian language, written in its own distinctive script that borrowed elements from both Phoenician and Greek writing systems, represents one of the most enigmatic linguistic puzzles of the ancient Mediterranean world, preserved only in scattered stone inscriptions, brief ceramic markings, and references made by classical Greek and Roman authors who recorded observations about this wealthy maritime trading civilization. The archaeological evidence suggests that Tartessian was neither Indo-European nor Semitic in its fundamental structure, standing as a linguistic isolate that seems to have developed independently or perhaps descended from substrate languages whose origins remain entirely unknown and thoroughly obscured by the mists of prehistoric time. What makes this linguistic mystery particularly compelling is the psychological compulsion that scholars and enthusiasts feel toward reconstructing even the most fragmentary aspects of this lost language, despite possessing only a handful of deciphered words and grammatical structures that provide barely enough material to form coherent understanding. The human mind appears naturally drawn toward filling gaps in knowledge, toward assembling puzzles from scattered pieces, and toward imposing meaningful patterns upon ambiguous evidence, which explains why linguists continue publishing hypotheses and interpretive studies based on extremely limited source material that can scarcely be said to constitute a comprehensive linguistic corpus. We have normalized this state of perpetual incompleteness regarding Tartessian, accepting that some languages from antiquity simply cannot be fully recovered, yet simultaneously maintaining scholarly interest and producing academic discourse about a tongue that remains fundamentally unknowable, continuing to theorize and debate and speculate about a civilization whose own people left too little behind for us to truly comprehend their linguistic world. Perhaps this enduring fascination with Tartessian ultimately reveals more about ourselves, our insatiable desire to resurrect the dead, to give voice to the silenced, and to believe that even the most fragmented whispers from antiquity contain truths worth pursuing, even when those truths remain forever suspended between speculation and silence. Deep within the territories of what is now southern Chile and Argentina, the Mapuche people developed one of the most sophisticated metalworking traditions in pre-Columbian South America, a craft so refined and technically advanced that it would eventually become central to their cultural identity and resistance against Spanish colonization. The Mapuche did not inherit significant silver working knowledge from their predecessors, nor did they have access to the elaborate state apparatus that funded the metallurgical innovations of the Inca Empire to their north. Yet through careful observation, experimentation, and an intuitive understanding of mineral properties, they mastered the art of transforming raw silver into objects of extraordinary beauty and symbolic power. Their smiths developed techniques for cold hammering, annealing, and the creation of intricate filigree work that allowed them to craft elaborate jewelry, ceremonial objects, and ornamental pieces that demonstrated a level of technical proficiency that rivaled or exceeded the work of many established metalworking centers throughout the ancient world. The Mapuche silver workers employed methods of ore extraction and purification that required extensive knowledge of geography, chemistry, and material science. Locating deposits in the Andes Mountains and developing processes to isolate and refine the metal through repeated heating and cooling cycles that enhanced its workability. What makes this achievement particularly remarkable is that the Mapuche accomplished this metallurgical sophistication without the centralized organization, written records, or imperial resources that typically supported such technological advancement in ancient societies, instead relying on oral transmission of knowledge, community-based apprenticeship systems, and an almost intuitive grasp of how materials behaved under different conditions. The psychological mechanism underlying this achievement appears rooted in the Mapuche's deep connection to their landscape and their willingness to engage in patient, iterative experimentation over generations, accumulating small discoveries that compound into comprehensive technical mastery, a process that suggests that sophisticated metallurgy does not necessarily require imperial bureaucracy or written technological documentation. In the ancient kingdom of Aksum, which flourished in the Horn of Africa from the 1st century onwards, engineers and laborers undertook one of antiquity's most remarkable logistical achievements: the quarrying, shaping, and transportation of massive stone obelisks that would serve as monuments to their civilization's power and spiritual devotion. These obelisks, some reaching heights of over 30 meters and weighing hundreds of tons, were extracted from granite quarries using bronze tools, wooden wedges, and patient hand labor, then moved across the challenging terrain of highland Ethiopia through mechanisms that remain partially mysterious to modern scholars who have studied the archaeological evidence left behind. The transportation process itself required the coordination of thousands of workers, the construction of specially designed wooden sledges, the preparation of pathways by leveling and smoothing the earth, and the use of rope systems made from natural fibers that would have needed constant replacement as they frayed and broke under the immense strain of moving stone monuments that seemed to defy the very laws of practical engineering. The psychological and logistical mechanism that allowed the Aksumites to accomplish this monumental task rested upon several interconnected factors. A deeply hierarchical society that could command massive labor forces through religious and political authority, a culture that valued eternal memorialization and divine connection highly enough to justify extraordinary expenditure of resources, advanced understanding of simple machines and weight distribution, and perhaps most significantly, a collective commitment to a vision larger than any individual's lifespan, creating a sense of purpose that transcended the immediate suffering and difficulty involved in the work itself. The obelisks represented not merely functional objects, but vessels of cosmic significance, meant to connect the earthly realm with the divine, and this spiritual dimension likely transformed the perspective of workers who might otherwise have questioned the rationality of such exhausting labor. Yet what persists as remarkable is how thoroughly the Aksumites normalized this extraordinary undertaking, treating it as an expected and regular feature of their civilization's expression, with multiple obelisks erected across different sites and periods, suggesting that rather than being unique anomalies, these transport operations became routine demonstrations of state power and religious devotion that society had integrated into its fundamental cultural practices. Scattered across the Indian subcontinent, standing as silent sentinels to a vanished empire, are the Mauryan pillars, magnificent stone columns erected during the reign of Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century before the Common Era. And among their most remarkable features exists a mysteriously lustrous surface known as Mauryan polish, a glossy finish that has bewildered archaeologists, historians, and materials scientists for centuries because these pillars possess a polished sheen so refined and mirror-like that when light strikes their surface, it reflects with an almost crystalline clarity, yet no tool marks remain visible beneath the gloss. No scratches or imperfections suggest the grinding and buffing techniques familiar to modern craftspeople. And perhaps most perplexing of all, this polish has survived more than 2,000 years of exposure to monsoon rains, temperature fluctuations, weathering, and human contact without significantly degrading or losing its characteristic luster. The psychological mechanism driving our fascination with this phenomenon stems from the fundamental human recognition that such perfection appears to transcend the limitations we understand about ancient technology. And when confronted with evidence of skill and sophistication that seems to exceed what we believe possible given the tools and knowledge available in antiquity, our minds naturally gravitate toward explanations that either invoke lost knowledge or deliberately obscure manufacturing secrets, creating a cognitive gap between expectation and observation that our rational frameworks struggle to reconcile. Scholars have proposed various theories about the creation of this polish, suggesting that the Mauryans may have utilized crushed feldspar, quartz, or other crystalline minerals combined with oils and repeated polishing over extended periods, or that specialized stone workers possessed techniques now forgotten, passed down through oral tradition and lost when the empire declined, yet despite reasonable explanations rooted in material science and ancient craftsmanship. The Mauryan pillar polish continues to captivate popular imagination and inspires ongoing speculation about secret recipes and hidden methodologies, demonstrating how readily we accept and perpetuate mystery around ancient achievements, finding comfort in the narrative of lost wisdom rather than acknowledging that our ancestors possessed practical knowledge and patient dedication that modern convenience has rendered unnecessary. And so these pillars stand as reminders that extraordinary results often emerge not from mystical processes, but from disciplined application of available resources, a truth we have somehow normalized into obscurity while elevating the polish itself into the realm of legend. In the arid deserts of northern Chile and southern Peru, where the Pacific Ocean meets some of Earth's driest landscape, there existed one of humanity's earliest and most sophisticated cultures, the Chinchorro people, who developed an elaborate system of mummification that predates even the Egyptian pyramids by nearly 2,000 years, suggesting that the human impulse to preserve the dead transcends geography and culture in ways we continue to contemplate. The Chinchorro practiced their craft beginning around 7,000 years ago, creating mummies not for kings and pharaohs as we often imagine, but for their entire population, from infants to the elderly, treating preservation of the deceased as a fundamental and democratic right that bound their communities together through shared ritual and purpose. The process itself was remarkably detailed and labor-intensive, beginning with the careful removal of skin from the body, which was then treated and set aside, while the internal organs were extracted, and the skeleton was reinforced with wooden sticks and plant fibers, creating a kind of internal framework that would support and stabilize the remains for generations to come. After this meticulous preparation, the body cavity was filled with clay, ash, and other materials, and then the skin was carefully replaced and sewn back onto the frame. The face was reconstructed with clay and paint, and finally a wig made from human hair or plant fibers was attached to complete the transformation from deceased person to preserved ancestor. What makes this practice particularly striking is not merely the technical sophistication it required, but the psychological understanding that underlies it. The Chinchorro seemed to recognize that death need not mean complete separation and loss, that through careful intervention and respectful handling of remains, the bonds between living and dead could be maintained, honored, and even strengthened across time. The mummification process itself likely served multiple functions simultaneously, both practical and spiritual, preserving bodies in a climate that naturally aided such preservation, yes, but also creating tangible objects that allowed communities to maintain relationships with their ancestors, to include them in ceremonies, to touch them, and to keep them present in daily life rather than distant in purely spiritual realms. Yet despite the logical reasons for this practice rooted in environmental conditions and social cohesion, the Chinchorro eventually abandoned mummification, and the reasons for this shift remain something of a mystery that historians and archaeologists continue to explore, suggesting that cultures evolve their relationships with death and preservation in ways that may seem to defy rational explanation alone. In the centuries before the Roman Empire solidified its grip on Europe, a network of trade routes existed that connected the Baltic coast to the Mediterranean, threading through the heartland of Central Europe with remarkable consistency and purpose. And at the center of this ancient commerce lay amber, that fossilized resin that had captured the imagination of civilizations for millennia. The Lusatian culture, which flourished in what is now modern-day Poland and eastern Germany from approximately the 13th to the 6th centuries before the Common Era, occupied a geographical position of extraordinary significance. Situated directly along the natural pathways that connected the amber-rich deposits of the Baltic region to the insatiable demand of Mediterranean traders who valued the substance for its luminous beauty, its rarity, and the symbolic power they attributed to its mystical origins. Archaeological evidence reveals that Lusatian settlements became increasingly sophisticated and wealthy during the period when amber trade intensified, with excavations uncovering vast quantities of worked amber ornaments, raw amber nodules, and finished goods that suggest not merely incidental contact with distant markets, but rather an organized, systematic trade operation that required knowledge of distant geography, established relationships with suppliers and buyers, and the development of standardized production methods. The mechanism underlying this amber trade was rooted in a fundamental human psychological principle: the attraction to objects of perceived rarity and supernatural origin. For amber, formed from ancient tree resin and often containing preserved insects and plant material, seemed to ancient peoples to possess almost mystical properties, as though it held within it the captured essence of time itself, and this perception granted tremendous value to a substance that, while not inherently scarce, became scarce through controlled extraction and careful trade management. Lusatian craftspeople responded to this demand by developing their own amber working traditions, creating distinctive jewelry, amulets, and decorative objects that reflected local aesthetic preferences while also adhering to the stylistic expectations of distant Mediterranean buyers. And this dual consciousness, the ability to produce for both local consumption and international export, required a level of cultural flexibility and market awareness that demonstrates these ancient peoples understood economic principles with surprising sophistication.